The torches along the palace walls had never felt so cold. Lena Calloway stood in the center of the great courtyard, her hands still, her chin level, her eyes fixed on a point just above the heads of the crowd that had gathered to watch her fall. 300 wolves stood in silence. Some of them had eaten at her father's table. Some of them had called her family. Not one of them moved. The Blood Moon ceremony was the oldest tradition in the Iron Vale Pack. It happened once a year, under the red-tinted sky of the harvest season, when the Alpha King stood before his people and made his declarations. New alliances, new laws, new punishments. Tonight, Lena was the declaration. She had known something was wrong when the guards came for her at dawn. Not pack guards, the king's personal guard. 4 of them, in black armor, standing outside her door without explanation or apology. They had not touched her. They had not needed to. The message was clear enough without words. She had dressed carefully. She had braided her dark hair back from her face the way her mother used to do it, tight and neat and dignified. She had chosen her green dress, the one that fit well and did not wrinkle. She did not know why those things had mattered to her in that moment. They had simply mattered, the way small things do when a person senses that everything larger is about to be taken away. The walk from her quarters to the courtyard had taken 11 minutes. She had counted. 11 minutes through corridors she had walked her whole life, past tapestries she had dusted as a child, past windows that looked out over gardens she had tended as a teenager when the groundskeeper was ill and no one else had volunteered. 11 minutes, and not one person had met her eyes. She had understood then. Now she stood in the courtyard under the blood-red moon, and Alpha King Kalen Voss stood 10 feet away from her on the stone platform where every declaration was made, and his face was exactly what she had expected it to be. Not angry, not satisfied, not regretful, simply closed. He was tall. He had always been tall, but the platform added to it, and the ceremonial coat added to that, and his expression added to everything else until he seemed like something carved from the mountain behind the palace rather than born from it. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw was sharp, his eyes, gray as winter water, moved over the crowd, and then settled on her with the particular kind of steadiness that belonged to people who had made a decision and would not be revisiting it. Lena had seen that look before. She had seen it when he sentenced a rogue wolf to banishment 2 years ago. She had thought then that she understood what it cost a person to look like that. She understood now that it cost him nothing at all. Elder Vasek stepped forward from his position beside the king and unrolled the scroll in his hands. He was a thin man, Elder Vasek, with careful eyes and a voice that carried without effort. He had been part of the Pack Council since before Lena was born. He had attended her father's funeral. He had held her hand at the graveside and told her that the Pack would always be her home. By order of Alpha King Kalen Voss, Elder Vasek read, in accordance with Pack law and the authority vested in the throne of Iron Vale, the rank, standing, and Pack membership of Lena Calloway, daughter of the late Omega Elder Garrett Calloway, is hereby permanently revoked. The courtyard was so quiet that Lena could hear the torches burning. She is stripped of all titles, all protections, and all rights afforded by Pack membership. She is to be escorted beyond the eastern border before the moon completes its rise. She is not to return. Any assistance given to her by a Pack member after this moment will be considered an act of defiance against the Alpha and punished accordingly. Vasek rolled the scroll closed. No reason was given. None was required under Pack law. The Alpha King's word was the law, and the law needed no explanation. Lena breathed in. She breathed out. She kept her eyes on that point above the crowd, the specific place where the wall met the night sky, and she did not let herself look at Kalen Voss. She had spent 3 months carefully not looking at Kalen Voss, because looking at him led to remembering things that were dangerous to remember, and this was the worst possible moment for that particular danger. 3 months ago, he had looked at her differently. She pressed that thought down hard and kept it there. One of the guards touched her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to mean it. She walked. The crowd parted for her. They did it efficiently, the way people do when they want to move away from something without appearing to hurry. No one spoke. A child near the back of the crowd made a small sound, and a woman pulled the child close and covered its mouth. An older man near the gate, one of the groundskeepers she had worked beside as a girl, turned his face away when she passed. Only one person met her eyes. A young woman near the far edge of the crowd, dark-skinned and sharp-faced, with close-cropped hair, and the look of someone who had decided she did not care what anyone thought of her. She was not a Pack member Lena knew well. She had seen her around the lower corridors, doing supply work, the kind of quiet necessary labor that kept a Pack running, and received no recognition. The young woman's eyes met Lena's for exactly 2 seconds. She gave one small, slow nod. Lena did not know what it meant. She filed it away anyway, because it was the only kindness she had received all night, and she thought she might need it later. The eastern gate was iron, old and heavy, and it opened with a sound like something tearing. The guards walked her through it. 3 of them. They walked her down the slope of the hill on which the palace sat, through the outer village that was still and dark at this hour, past the last cluster of pack houses where lights burned in upper windows, and faces pressed close to glass without opening it. At the edge of the tree line, the guards stopped. The oldest of them, a broad man with a scar crossing his chin, held out a pack. Canvas. Old but intact. She took it. He did not explain what was inside. He turned around and walked back toward the palace without looking at her. The other 2 followed. Lena stood at the edge of the outer lands with the pack in her hands and the blood moon above her, and the sound of the eastern gate closing behind her, and she stayed very still for a long time. The outer lands were not empty. Everyone in the pack knew that, though the subject was handled with the particular discomfort that surrounded anything the pack did not officially acknowledge. Rogue wolves lived there, people who had been exiled, or who had never belonged to any pack, or who had chosen to leave. They built communities of a kind, loose and shifting, with their own rules and their own silences. The pack considered them dangerous. Lena had always suspected the pack considered them dangerous primarily because they were uncontrolled, and control was the thing the pack valued above everything else. She opened the canvas pack. Inside, a water skin, half full, a piece of cloth that might serve as a blanket if she was desperate and creative about it. 3 strips of dried meat, a small knife with a handle worn smooth from use, and at the very bottom, folded small, a single piece of paper. She unfolded it in the moonlight. It was a map, hand-drawn, careful, with landmarks marked in small, neat handwriting. A route through the eastern forest. At the end of it, a small circle with 2 words beside it. Mira's camp. No signature. Lena looked back at the palace once. The torches were still burning. The courtyard was empty now. From here, the building looked exactly as it always had. Solid, permanent, indifferent. She put the map in her pocket, shouldered the pack, and walked into the trees. The forest at night was not the terrifying place that stories made it out to be. Not for a wolf, even an Omega. Her senses were sharp enough to track the path, to hear the things moving in the dark and categorize them as harmless, to feel the shift in wind that told her rain was coming. She had grown up near this forest. She had run its edges in her shifted form as a child, before her father got sick and running for pleasure became a thing she no longer had time for. She walked for 3 hours without stopping. The map was good. The landmarks matched. A split oak, a dry stream bed, a ridge of dark stone that caught the moonlight in a way that made it easy to find. She followed each one in sequence, and somewhere past the 2nd hour, she stopped thinking about the courtyard and started thinking about the next step, and then the one after that, and that was better. That was survivable. She smelled the camp before she saw it. Wood smoke, something cooking, leather and animal, and the particular warm scent of people who had been living close to the earth. And underneath all of it, the distinct note of wolf. Multiple wolves, none of them Iron Veil. She stopped at the edge of the tree line. "You're slower than I expected," a voice said. The woman from the courtyard stepped out of the shadow of a large pine. Up close, she was younger than Lena had thought. Mid-20s maybe. She was wearing practical clothes, dark and layered, and she had a way of standing that suggested she had already assessed every possible direction Lena might run, and found each of them manageable. "You were there," Lena said, "at the ceremony." "Supply delivery. I go in twice a month." The woman tilted her head. "My name is Mira. I drew the map. Come inside before the rain starts." Lena looked at her for a moment. "Why?" Mira considered the question seriously, which Lena appreciated. "Because your father was a decent man, and decent men don't have their daughters thrown out in the cold without someone making sure they reach morning." She turned and walked toward the camp. "Also, I have soup. Come or don't." Lena came. The camp was small but organized. 6 structures, a mix of built and found materials, arranged in a loose circle around a central fire that was banked low for the night. She counted at least 8 people by the shapes moving in the firelight. More, probably, sleeping. Mira brought her to the nearest structure, which turned out to be half tent, half permanent, with a wooden floor that had been laid down with real care. There was a pot hanging over a small internal flame, and the soup inside it was real soup, thick with roots and something that might have been dried mushroom. And Lena sat on a wooden stool and held the bowl in both hands and realized she was shaking. Not with cold. With the particular aftermath of spending hours holding herself together. She ate. She did not cry. She was not going to cry. Not yet. Possibly not ever, because crying required a level of surrender that she was not prepared to offer. Mira sat across from her and said nothing, which was exactly right. When the bowl was empty, Lena set it down and looked at the woman who had mapped her route and waited in the dark and made soup. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." Mira leaned back against the wall. "I know Garrett Calloway spent 6 years quietly sending food packages to families in this camp. He never told anyone. He just did it. That tells me about his daughter." Lena's throat tightened. She pressed it flat. "He never mentioned it." "He wouldn't." Mira looked at the fire. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." "I don't know what the rest looks like." "Neither do I. But mornings are better for figuring." Mira stood, picked up the bowl, and moved toward the tent opening. Then she paused. "There's a blanket on the left. The floor is harder than it looks but warmer than outside. The rain's starting." She left. Lena sat in the quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain begin against the canvas above her. It came gently at first, then steadier, filling the silence with a sound that was almost kind. She lay down on the wooden floor with the blanket pulled over her and stared at the ceiling, and thought about 11 minutes of corridors and one woman's nod in a crowd of 300, and a map folded small at the bottom of a canvas pack, and she thought that if that was what remained of a life, it was still something. She thought about Kalen Voss's closed face. She pressed that down harder than anything else. She slept. In the morning the rain had stopped, and the camp was already moving. Someone had started a cooking fire. Children, she realized with mild surprise, were chasing something small and brown near the eastern edge of the camp. People nodded to her when she emerged. No one asked questions. Mira handed her tea, hot and bitter, and showed her where the water was and where the latrine was, and what the camp rules were. The rules were simple. Contribute what you can, take what you need, cause no deliberate harm, keep the fire going. There was no hierarchy. Decisions were made by the people most affected by them. It was nothing like the pack. Lena thought she might, in time, find that a relief. She spent the first day doing useful things. She helped patch a section of roof that the rain had loosened. She organized a supply shelf that had gotten disordered. She sat with a young boy who was bored and taught him a card game her father had taught her when she was small. She did not think about the palace. She thought about the next small task. It was not happiness. It was not anything she could name yet. But it was forward motion, and forward motion was what she had. That evening, sitting by the fire with a bowl of something warm, she pulled the canvas pack onto her lap and went through it again more carefully. The water skin, the cloth, the knife, the dried meat. And one thing she had missed the night before. At the very bottom of the pack, tucked into a seam so that it sat flat and invisible, a small folded paper, different from the map, with a single sentence written on it in handwriting she did not recognize. She read it twice. The decree was not signed by the king alone. She sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she folded it, placed it at the bottom of the pack, and looked at the fire, and thought that forward motion was very well and good, but that she would need to start keeping her eyes open for more than just the next small task. Above her, through the trees, the moon was white now, clean and ordinary, and it told her nothing she did not already know. She was alive. She was outside. She was going to need to be very careful about what she noticed, and what she did with what she noticed, and who she allowed herself to trust. Back in the palace, behind those iron gates, something had been set in motion that was larger than her exile. She did not know what it was yet, but she intended to find out. Mira did not ask questions, but she watched everything. Lena noticed this within the first week. The camp leader's eyes moved constantly, cataloging, measuring, filing things away. She watched how people carried their weight in the morning before the day's work started. She watched how they ate. She watched how they reacted when something unexpected happened. She was not suspicious in the way that made people uncomfortable. She was simply thorough, the way a person is thorough when they have been responsible for others long enough to know that small details often carry large consequences. On the 8th morning, Mira sat down beside Lena at the fire and said, "You're not sleeping." "I'm sleeping fine," Lena said. Mira gave her a look that suggested she found this answer approximately as convincing as a locked door held shut with string. "You're up before dawn. I can hear you moving around." "I've always been an early riser." "Maybe." Mira poured tea into both their cups. "And maybe you lie there for 2 hours first. Either way, it's not my business. I just want you to know that if you do want to talk, I'm someone who keeps things to herself." Lena looked at the fire. "I don't talk well. Neither do I, but I listen well." Mira wrapped both hands around her cup. "What was your father like?" The question came so quietly and so naturally that Lena answered before she thought about it. Careful, she said. He was very careful with everything, with money and with words and with people. He never said anything he didn't mean, and he never made a promise he didn't keep. She paused. He was also funny, but only when he thought no one important was listening. Mira smiled. It changed her whole face. He used to send the packages in unmarked crates. No name, no note. One of the older women in camp spent 3 years convinced they were from the spirits of the forest. He would have loved that, Lena said. And then, because the image of her father delighted by that particular piece of accidental mythology was too specific and too real, she felt the thread of grief move through her like weather, and she held it. Mira watched the fire and said nothing more. That was how the second week began. By the third week, Lena had found a rhythm. She woke at dawn, did her share of the morning work, spent the middle part of the day doing whatever needed doing, and in the evenings she sat by the fire and listened to the camp talk, and slowly, carefully, began to learn who each person was. There was Owen, who had been exiled from a northern pack for refusing to participate in a punishment he considered unjust. He was large and quiet, and extraordinarily good at building things, and he had been in the camp longer than anyone except Mira. There was Della, who was maybe 60 and had never belonged to any pack and seemed to find the whole concept slightly amusing. There were the Barrow brothers, twin boys of about 12 who had been born in the camp and had never known anything else, and who treated everything with the kind of cheerful relentlessness that only belonged to children who had been raised in communities rather than structures. And there was Colin. Colin was 28, which was only 3 years older than Lena, and he had come to the camp 6 months before her arrival, after leaving a southern pack under circumstances he described only as a difference of priorities. He had light hair and a careful manner, and he brought Lena tea one morning without being asked, and when she thanked him, he said, "I just made too much," with such obvious honesty that she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since the courtyard. The sound surprised her. It surprised him too. "You should do that more," he said, and walked away before the sentence could be awkward. She filed that away in the same pocket where she kept the note at the bottom of the pack, the pocket where she put things she didn't know what to do with yet. The note. She thought about it more than she admitted to herself. The decree was not signed by the king alone. 7 words, handwriting she didn't know. A seam in a pack that had been assembled for her specifically, which meant someone inside the palace had put that note there, someone who had access to the king's guard and to the supply of exile packs, and who had chosen to put information rather than comfort into that particular small space. Someone who wanted her to know without wanting to be known. She turned it over in her mind during the long afternoons when her hands were busy and her thoughts were free. The exile decree. Elder Vasek had read it aloud. It had not occurred to her to think about who had signed it, because in the moment, the only signature that mattered was the king's. The Alpha King's word was final. Any other signature was ceremonial. Was it? She didn't know enough about pack law to be certain. Her father had known pack law, but her father was gone. She had grown up in the pack. She had been educated in the pack. But Omega education focused on community function, healing, mediation, child-rearing, record-keeping, not governance, not the specific mechanics of how decrees were formalized. She needed to find someone who knew those mechanics. She thought about asking Mira. She thought about it for several days and then decided against it, not because she didn't trust Mira, but because involving Mira in something that came with this particular flavor of risk felt like a debt she hadn't earned the right to create. Instead, she asked Della. Della was sitting in her usual spot beside the camp's storage building, repairing a piece of leather harness with the focused attention she brought to everything. She was the oldest person in the camp and, Lena had come to understand, probably the most educated. "I have a question about pack law," Lena said, sitting down nearby. Della did not look up from her work. "Ask it then. What does it mean if an exile decree carries more than one signature?" Della's hands stilled for exactly 1 second, then resumed their work. "Where did you read that?" "I didn't read it. Someone told me my decree wasn't signed only by the king." Della was quiet for a moment. The leather moved through her fingers steadily. Under standard pack law, the Alpha King's signature alone is sufficient for any decree. Decrees are occasionally co-signed by council elders for political reasons, to show agreement, to spread responsibility for controversial decisions. It changes nothing legally. "But?" Della looked up then. Her eyes were dark and very sharp. "But if a decree is co-signed by a council elder without the king's knowledge, that is a different matter entirely. That is a forgery, or near enough to one. And if the king were to discover it, the consequences for that elder would be significant." Lena kept her voice even. "What kind of significant?" "Removal from council, possible exile, possible worse, depending on the king's temperament and what the forged decree was meant to accomplish. Della looked at her steadily. Why are you asking me this? Lena met her eyes. Someone put a note in my exile pack. Said the decree had a second signature. I don't know whose. Della put the harness down. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. Your father came to me once, she said. Years ago, when you were still small. He was worried about the direction of the council. He didn't say specifically what worried him. He just said he thought someone on the council was building something that didn't serve the pack. She paused. I told him to be careful. I think he was. I also think being careful only goes so far when someone has decided to move against you. The air between them was quiet. Elder Vasek, Lena said. Della did not confirm it. She simply picked up the harness again. I can't tell you anything about people I've never met, she said. What I can tell you is that if you have that note, you should keep it somewhere safe. And if you ever find out whose handwriting it is, that person is either a friend with a great deal of courage or a trap with a great deal of patience, and you should be able to tell the difference before you respond. It was the most Della had ever said in one sitting. Lena thanked her and walked back to the camp's central area, and she sat on a log near the fire and watched the afternoon light change, and she thought about her father's careful face and his habit of making promises he kept, and his quiet belief that the right thing was usually the harder thing. He had known something was wrong on the council, and then he had died. Not dramatically, not mysteriously, not in a way that would cause anyone to look twice. He had become ill during a cold winter, the way older pack members sometimes did, and he had grown weaker over 3 months, and then he had been gone. She had been 17. She had buried him and carried on. She had never questioned the illness. She was questioning it now. She pressed that thought down very firmly, because it was the kind of thought that, once loose, could become consuming, and she did not have enough information yet to justify consuming thoughts. Suspicions required evidence before they were allowed to grow into certainties. Her father had taught her that too. That evening, Colin sat down near her, without invitation or apology, and said, You look like someone carrying something heavy. Everyone here is carrying something heavy, Lena said. True, he looked at the fire. I'm not going to ask what it is. I just thought I'd say that it can be a good idea to put something heavy down sometimes, even if only for an hour. And if I put it down and someone else picks it up? He considered this seriously. Then you'll have an hour's rest and a reason to be angry. Both are better than nothing. She almost smiled. That's a strange kind of comfort. I'm a strange kind of person. He stood up. Mira's making the good bread tonight. You should eat it while it's warm. He wandered off. She ate the bread. It was, in fact, very good. 3 days later, she was helping Mira repair a section of the camp's eastern fence when Mira said, without looking up from her work, Someone came through the northern pass last night. Pack Scout. Lena's hands paused, then continued. Did they come into camp? No. They stayed in the trees, watching. Mira tested a fence post, found it stable, moved on. They left before dawn. Looking for someone? Probably. Mira didn't say who. She didn't have to. We move camps every few months anyway. I'd been thinking about moving a bit early this time. Lena looked at the fence post they had just fixed. How much work would be lost? Some. The fixed structures can't come with us, but the people matter more than the structures. Mira looked at her sideways. That's not a reference to anything specific, just a general position I hold. Lena understood anyway. She helped with the fence and said nothing more about it. That night she lay on the wooden floor in the tent that had become her space and stared at the ceiling and thought about pack scouts and distances and what it meant that someone was already looking. She thought about the note. She thought about what Della had said. She was not ready to go back. She was not ready for anything as clear or direct as going back. But she was starting to understand that the situation she had been placed in was not as simple as punishment or politics or a king's cold indifference. There were layers beneath it. Someone had wanted her out. Someone had signed that decree and then hidden the signature. Someone had put a note in her pack. 2 different someones maybe, or the same one, which would be stranger and more interesting. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. She thought, I need more time. She thought, I might not have it. She thought about the scout in the trees. Then she thought about something else entirely, something her body had been hinting at for 2 weeks, and her mind had been refusing to acknowledge. She had put the refusal down to stress and disruption, and the entirely reasonable disarray that followed the destruction of one's entire life. But it had now been long enough that refusing to acknowledge it was no longer a position she could hold. She lay very still. She counted backward in her mind, then forward, then backward again. The numbers came out the same every time, which meant her mind was not making an arithmetic error. which meant the numbers said what they said. She breathed in. She breathed out. There were no words for what she was feeling in that moment. Not quite fear, not quite disbelief, something that encompassed both and added a third element she couldn't name, something that lived in the chest rather than the mind and made the walls of the tent look different than they had 30 seconds ago. She put her hand flat against the floor. She breathed. She thought, one thing at a time. She thought, morning is better for figuring. She lay in the dark and listened to the camp sleep and thought that the note at the bottom of her pack was no longer the most complicated thing she was carrying. Not by a long way. The morning was clear and cold, frost on the grass, the Barrow boys already running at the edge of the camp, chasing each other with the particular energy of children who had slept well and needed somewhere to put it. Lena washed her face in cold water and stood outside the tent and breathed the morning air and told herself that the numbers were just numbers and that one morning at a time was still the correct approach. Then she walked to where Mira was starting the cooking fire and said, I need to talk to you about something. Mira looked at her, put down the kindling, waited. When does the healer come through next? Lena asked. Mira had steady eyes, the kind that absorbed information without reacting to it on the surface. 3 days, she said. Her name is Nessa. She comes through once a month, checks in with the camp, leaves medicine. Can she do a confirmation? A specific kind? A pause. Very small. What kind specifically? Lena looked at the frost on the ground. She had told herself she would say this clearly and without wavering, because wavering made things harder, and things were already hard enough. I think I might be carrying a child, she said. I need to know for certain. Mira was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the kindling and began laying the fire again with the same careful hands she used for everything. Nessa will know how to confirm it, she said. I'll let her know to come straight here when she arrives. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just sit down. I'm making breakfast, and you look like you haven't eaten enough lately. Mira paused. You're going to need to start eating more. She said it without inflection, just a statement, a practical observation. Lena sat down on a camp stool and listened to the fire catch and looked at the frost melting in the morning light, and she thought that Mira was exactly the kind of person her father would have trusted, and that was enough for now. 3 days was 3 days. She could hold one thing at a time for 3 days. She breathed in, she breathed out. Above the trees, the sky was perfectly blue, the deep particular blue of early autumn mornings before the cold got serious, and it was one of the most ordinary things she had ever seen, and she was grateful for it in a way she could not have explained. The frost finished melting. The Barrow boys came back for breakfast. Owen appeared from somewhere with an armload of wood and added it to the stack without being asked. The camp moved forward into its day, the way camps do, the way people do. Lena moved forward with it. Nessa arrived at noon on the 3rd day, exactly when Mira said she would. She was a small woman, compact and purposeful. With silver-streaked hair she wore loose, and hands that moved with the practiced economy of someone who had been providing care for a long time. She carried a worn leather bag that clinked when she walked. She greeted Mira with a hug that had the warmth of long familiarity, checked in with Owen about the camp's general health, ruffled the Barrow boy's hair, and then looked at Lena with eyes that asked no questions and judged nothing. You must be Lena, she said. Mira mentioned you'd arrived. Shall we go somewhere quieter? The tent was quiet enough. Nessa set her bag down and went through a short examination that was gentle and thorough, and did not require Lena to say much. She asked dates, she asked symptoms. She worked through a series of checks with herbs and small tools that Lena did not fully recognize, and she was efficient about it, wasting no motion. When she was done, she put her tools away and sat back and looked at Lena with clear eyes. 11 weeks, she said. Give or take a few days. Everything appears healthy. Lena had known. She had known for 3 days, had been carrying the knowledge with the particular care of someone holding something fragile over a hard floor. Having it confirmed was different from knowing it. Having it confirmed made it real in a way that knowing it had not. She looked at her own hands. The father, Nessa said carefully. Is he available? No, Lena said. Nessa nodded once. She did not pursue it. Then we talk about what you need. Nutrition first. You're thin from the road and that needs to change. I'm going to leave you a list of what to eat and how much. Mira's camp is good for most of it, but there are a few things I'll bring you next month. She began writing on a small piece of paper. Rest matters more than you think right now. Sleep when you can, and I want you to find a way to manage stress. Lena looked at her. I was exiled 11 weeks ago. I have no pack, no home, and now this. What would you suggest for managing stress? Nessa looked up from her paper with the faintest trace of a smile. I'd suggest exactly what you're doing, staying somewhere safe with people who won't hurt you, keeping your hands busy, and not making any decisions larger than today until you have to. She finished writing and folded the paper. You're stronger than you look. Everyone keeps telling me that. Then perhaps consider that everyone has eyes. Nessa pressed the paper into Lena's hand. I'll be back in 4 weeks. Come find me if anything changes before then. She left without fuss, the way good people often do. Lena sat in the tent for a while after she left. 11 weeks, which meant the child had been there during the blood moon ceremony, had been there during the exile decree, had been there during 11 minutes of corridors and 3 hours of walking and the first night on the wooden floor, present for all of it and unknown to her. She thought about what Nessa had said. Everything appears healthy. She pressed her hand flat against her own middle. Not quite a greeting, not quite a promise, something in between. Then she stood up, put the paper in her pack, and went back to the camp. Mira was near the cooking fire when she came out. She glanced up, read whatever was on Lena's face, and said nothing. She handed Lena a cup of tea and went back to what she was doing. That was one of the things Lena was learning to value most, the particular respect of people who understood that not every moment needed words. Colin found her that evening by the fire. He did not sit down this time. He stood a few feet away, with his hands in his pockets, and said, I heard the healer came. She does every month, you said. She does. He looked at the fire rather than at her. You all right? It was such a simple question. She could not remember the last time someone had asked it of her with this particular quality of simplicity, without agenda or expectation, just a genuine wondering about the state of another person. I'm figuring things out, she said. That's a reasonable answer. He turned to go, then paused. If you need anything. Not being polite. Just, if you need something and you think I might be able to help, ask. I'll keep that in mind. He nodded and walked away. She sat with the fire for a long time after everyone else had gone to sleep. She thought about the child, and she thought about the note, and she thought about Elder Vossick's voice reading the decree, and she thought about Kalen Voss's closed face, that expression of perfect indifference, and she thought about the bond night 3 months ago that he had apparently decided never happened. She had not let herself think about that night. She had been rigorous about not thinking about it, because thinking about it was a kind of wound that would not clot if she kept pressing on it. But now there was a reason she could not avoid, a specific concrete reason why the night and all it contained was not something she could file away. She thought about it now, carefully, the way you approach something you are afraid of touching. The bond night had not been planned. That was the only true thing she could say about it with certainty. She had been in the palace's East Wing library late at night, working on records for the Healer's Hall, and he had come in looking for something, and there had been a conversation that started with an exchange about the record she was working on, and ended with nothing she had the vocabulary for. The pull between alphas and omegas was old and instinctive, and she had grown up knowing about it academically, had spent her whole life around it in a pack environment, but she had never experienced it directly, and the experience was not what any of the academic understanding had prepared her for. It was not a loss of self. That was what she wanted to be clear about, even just to herself. She had been present for all of it. She had made choices, so had he. And then morning came and he had been different. Not cold, not immediately. More like someone who had made a decision she couldn't see, had drawn a line somewhere while she was sleeping and was standing on the other side of it by the time the sun rose. Polite, distant, the face of the Alpha King rather than the face of the person she had spoken with the night before. Within 2 weeks, the political engagement had been announced. Another pack's daughter, a stronger alliance, a cleaner line of succession. Within 3 months, the exile decree. She had spent the time between these events telling herself that she had misunderstood, that the bond night had meant less than she thought, that she was an Omega reading things into an Alpha's behavior because that was what her biology wanted her to do, and her biology was not the same thing as truth. She sat with the fire and she thought that she had been correct to hold that careful separation between what she felt and what she knew. But she also thought that now, for a specific and undeniable reason, the separation was becoming harder to maintain. The child was not a feeling. The child was a fact. And the child's father was a man who had declared her dead to his pack and signed her exile and was now engaged to someone else. And the child did not know any of this yet, and that was probably for the best. She stood up. Her knees were stiff from the cold ground. She stretched, looked at the dark sky above the trees, and thought about what Nessa had said. Not the part about nutrition, the part about decisions. Don't make any decisions larger than today until you have to. She was not going to send word to the palace. She was not going to reveal herself. She was going to eat what was on the paper Nessa had given her, and she was going to sleep as much as she could, and she was going to continue making herself useful to the camp that had taken her in. That was today's decision. Tomorrow she would make tomorrow's. She went back to the tent and lay down on the floor, and pulled the blanket over herself, and thought that her father would have told her to think carefully and act slowly, and trust no one more than she could afford to. She thought that her father had also been a person who sent food in unmarked crates so that strangers' children didn't go hungry, and that there was something in that gesture that she had not yet finished understanding. She slept. In the morning, Owen arrived at the camp entrance with a stranger at his side. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, with a calm face and a scar across his left hand that Lena recognized. She had seen that scar before. It had belonged to one of her father's council colleagues, a man named Aldrich who had sat on the Omega Advisory Committee and who had gone quiet and absent from pack gatherings about a year before her father died. She had assumed he had simply stopped attending. She understood now that she had assumed incorrectly. Aldrich came directly to her. He sat down on the camp stool she indicated and looked at her with eyes that were tired in a deep way, the way people are tired when they have been carrying a burden over a long distance. "I've been looking for a way to reach you safely," he said. "It took time to arrange." Lena watched him. "You put the note in the pack?" "Yes." "Whose signature is on the decree?" Aldrich looked at his scarred hand. "Elder Vasek co-signed the exile decree. The king signed first, yes. But Vasek added his signature in the hours after, on the official record copy, without the king's knowledge or instruction." He paused. "I was a clerk on the council before I left. I had access to the official records. I saw the second signature before I fled." "Why did you leave the pack?" "Because I made the mistake of asking Vasek what the second signature meant. He said it simply, without drama. He gave me 2 days to leave quietly, before he made sure I left less quietly." Lena was very still. "What is Vasek building?" "Control," Aldrich said. "Your exile was the beginning. Vasek wants the king isolated. He wants to be the primary voice in Kalen's ear. He's been removing anyone from the council who might push back against him. Your father was the last effective opposition. You were a loose end." The fire crackled. A bird called from the tree line. "My father," Lena said. Aldrich looked at her. "I don't know what happened to your father. I want to be honest about that. I have suspicions that I cannot prove. What I know is that after his death, the opposition to Vasek on the council collapsed within 6 months." She breathed in, steady, out, steady. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you're the only person connected to the palace who is outside Vasek's reach," Aldrich said. "And because you have something that makes you more powerful than you realize." "I've been exiled and stripped of every protection I had." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "And you're carrying the Alpha King's heir." The words landed like stones in still water. "I haven't told anyone that," Lena said. "Nessa has worked with this camp for 4 years. She is trusted. She said nothing to anyone outside the camp." He paused. "But wolves can sense these things. The scout who watched your camp 2 weeks ago. He went back and filed a report. The report said you looked different, healthier, changed." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "I believe Vasek has already deduced what that might mean, and if Vasek knows, then the king will be told in whatever version Vasek chooses to tell him." Lena looked at the fire. She thought, one thing at a time was no longer sufficient. She thought, the time for today's decisions had just become very short. She looked at Aldrich and she said, "Tell me everything you know. Start with my father. Start at the beginning." He told her. It took a long time. When he was done, the fire had burned down to coals and the camp was quiet around them, and Lena sat with everything she now knew, and held it carefully, and thought about her father's careful hands, and his unmarked crates, and his habit of acting rightly without announcement. She reached into her pack. She took out the small folded note, 7 words. She looked at them one more time. She put it back. "You should stay in the camp," she said to Aldrich. "Talk to Mira, she'll find you space." "What are you going to do?" he asked. Lena looked at the coals. "I'm going to figure out what I owe and to whom," she said, "and then I'm going to figure out how to collect it." She slept badly that night, not from fear but from the particular restlessness of a mind that had too much new information, and not enough structure to hold it in. She lay on her side with her hand pressed against the floor, feeling the solid weight of the earth beneath the wood, and she worked through what Aldrich had told her piece by piece, turning each piece over, testing it. Her father had been the last opposition. Vasek had built his position over years, slowly, in the way that patient people build things, one stone at a time, each stone placed so quietly that no one noticed until the wall was already there. He had aligned himself with weaker council members. He had recommended appointments that suited him. He had been the voice in the room that always knew the law best, always had the precedent ready, always could produce the right document at the right moment. And all the while, Garrett Calloway had watched and worried and sent food in unmarked crates and made no move that could be used against him. Until he died. She thought about what Aldrich had said. I don't know what happened to your father. Suspicions I cannot prove. She thought about winter illness and 3 months of decline and a man who had always been careful but could not be careful enough. She pressed the thought flat, not because she was afraid of it, because grief required permission and she had not granted it yet. There would be a time for grief. There would be a time for everything she was not allowing herself to feel. That time was not tonight. She rolled onto her back and stared at the tent ceiling and thought about the scout's report. She looked different, healthier, changed. Wolves did not need a healer to identify certain things. A pack alpha's bond signature, the particular quality of the bond night, was something that left traces. Not visible ones. Something in the way a person moved through space, the way they smelled, the way their energy settled. She did not know if Vasek would recognize it. She did not know if the scout would have known well enough to name it in a report. But she knew Aldrich was right that Vasek would wonder. And wondering was enough for a man like Vasek. A man like that did not leave questions unanswered when he had the power to pursue them. And she thought about the death order. It had not come yet. But it would come, if Vasek had already begun to suspect. The question was timing. Vasek would not move rashly. He would want to be certain before he acted. He would want to verify. Verification took time. She had time. Maybe. A little. She sat up in the dark and found her pack and pulled it onto her lap and held it. Inside, water skin, cloth, knife, dried meat, Nessa's paper, Aldrich's knowledge, the note with 7 words. And the child, which was not in the pack but was there anyway. She thought, what does this child need from me right now? The answer was simple. Survival. Distance. A mother who was not paralyzed. She set the pack down and lay back and closed her eyes and breathed until the thinking quieted to something manageable. She needed to start moving before Vasek moved first. She needed information from inside the palace. She needed to understand what Kalen Voss had been told and what he had not been told, and what kind of man he was when no one was constructing his decisions for him. She needed, above all, to stop thinking of herself as someone who had lost everything and start thinking of herself as someone who had been given an extremely complicated reason to fight. The child kicked for the first time at that exact moment. It was very faint, like a flutter rather than a movement, like someone knocking gently on a door to see if anyone was home. Lena put her hand against her middle again. "Hello?" she said quietly to the tent ceiling. Then she closed her eyes and slept, and this time she slept well. Back in the palace, the roses were dying. It happened every autumn, of course. Everyone knew it happened every autumn. The groundskeeping staff trimmed them back in preparation for winter with the same efficiency they applied to every seasonal task. But the head groundskeeper, an older man named Patrick who had held his position for 22 years, had been watching the roses outside the East Wing library for the better part of a week, and he had the distinct impression that they were dying slightly earlier than usual, and with more thoroughness than he could account for with seasonal logic alone. He mentioned this to no one. Patrick had long ago learned that mentioning things was a complicated act, and that the same information, delivered to different people, could produce wildly different consequences. Inside the palace, other things were also dying slightly earlier than usual. The East Wing itself had been sealed 2 months ago. No official announcement. No explanation offered to the staff who cleaned it. The doors were simply locked one morning, and the corridors that led to them were redirected, and anyone who asked was told that the East Wing was under structural assessment and would reopen when the assessment was complete. The East Wing contained the library. It also contained a small series of rooms that had, 3 months ago, been occupied in the late evenings by a particular member of the palace staff. These things were connected, or not, depending on who was asked. No one asked Kalen Voss. Asking the Alpha King direct questions required both authorization and courage, and the people who had authorization tended to lack the courage, and the people who had the courage tended to lack the authorization. Kalen Voss sat in his council chamber at the north end of the palace and did what he had been doing for the past month, governing. He governed with the focused, systematic efficiency that had defined his rule since he took the throne 7 years ago at 24, inheriting a pack that had been mismanaged by a distracted predecessor and spending 3 years hammering it back into shape through the application of structured will. He was good at it. He had never pretended to find it particularly meaningful, but he was good at it, and meaningfulness had never struck him as a prerequisite for effective rule. Elder Vasek sat to his left at the council table, as he always did. Vasek was speaking now, running through the summary of the Eastern Border Survey, with the particular fluency of someone who had prepared this summary, and prepared it well, and knew it served multiple purposes simultaneously. The border survey was real and important. The summary also, Vasek hoped, would redirect the Alpha's attention from certain other matters. The Eastern Territories have shown a 17% increase in rogue wolf activity over the past quarter, Vasek said. My recommendation is additional patrol rotations and a revision of the boundary markers that have deteriorated over the past 2 seasons. Agreed, Kalen said. Get with Owen. He paused. Get with the patrol captain. Have them draft a revised schedule by week's end. He had almost said a different name, a name he did not use in council chambers. He moved forward without change of expression. The council meeting continued. 3 more matters. 2 were administrative. 1 was the political engagement, which was proceeding. The arrangement with the Whitfield pack was solid, and the formal ceremony was scheduled for early winter. Councilmember Petra handled this update with careful optimism, watching the Alpha's face for any sign of how he was receiving the information. She found nothing. She never found anything in his face anymore. When the meeting ended and the room emptied, Kalen remained seated. He did not move for a moment. Then he picked up the small glass of water on the table in front of him and turned it in his fingers without drinking from it. His personal attendant, a young man named Peter who had been in his service for 2 years and who had survived in this role by combining extreme competence with an apparently natural talent for invisibility, moved to clear the table. Leave it, Kalen said. Peter left it. The scout who filed the report from the Outer Lands last month, Kalen said. Riordan. Peter was very still. Yes, sir. He said she looked different. That was in the report, sir, yes. A pause. Did he elaborate on that when he came back? In person, not just the written report. Peter chose his words with the care of someone who understood that the wrong word in this particular conversation could travel in unpredictable directions. He mentioned that she appeared well, sir. He said she seemed... Peter hesitated. He said she seemed settled. That was the word he used. Settled. Kalen set the glass down. What does that mean? I believe he meant that she appeared to have found accommodation, that she wasn't in distress. Was she alone? He observed her briefly. He reported she appeared to be in the company of others. A rogue camp of some kind. Peter paused. He did not provide details about the camp's size or composition. He had been instructed only to confirm her location and status. Who gave him those instructions? Another careful pause. Elder Vasek authorized the scout deployment, sir. Standard protocol for monitoring. I know the protocol. Kalen stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the gardens were in their autumn state, muted and brown, and Patrick was somewhere out there being thoughtful about roses. When was I shown the scout report? Elder Vasek presented it at the Eastern Affairs briefing, sir. 3 weeks ago. And the original report, the full version. Peter was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I would need to check the records office to be certain of what the original report contained, sir. Kalen looked at the gardens. Check. Yes, sir. Today, Peter. Yes, sir. Peter left. Kalen stood at the window and watched the gardens and thought about a word. Settled. He turned it over the way he had been turning it over for 3 weeks, since Riordan had filed his report and Vasek had presented a summary of it that had felt, in some way Kalen could not precisely identify, like a summary with something missing from it. He had told himself he was being unreasonable. He had told himself that the missing quality was his own wishful thinking, which was an embarrassing diagnosis but an accurate one. He had told himself that she was an exiled Omega living in the Outer Lands, and that the word settled was exactly what it appeared to be, and that his interest in her was a reflex response to a situation his biology found significant, nothing more. He had been telling himself these things for 3 weeks. He was growing less persuaded. He had made a decision. Decisions, by definition, did not get reconsidered once made. He was very clear on this. He had been clear on it since he was 22 years old and watched his predecessor agonize over a decision until the window for making it closed and the consequences arrived uninvited. Kalen had promised himself that his rule would not look like that. His rule would be decisive. He had been decisive. He thought about the East Wing and the locked doors and the fact that he had not gone in there once since she left, and the fact that this was not sentiment, this was simply a matter of the East Wing being under structural assessment. He thought about the engagement to the Whitfield pack's daughter, a perfectly appropriate alliance with a young woman who was composed and sensible, and who looked at him with an expression of careful courtesy that he understood completely, because he wore the same expression himself. He thought about the exile decree on the night he signed it, the pen in his hand, Vasek standing at his right shoulder saying, "This is the cleanest solution, my king," and the way Kalen had looked at the paper and thought about 11 minutes of corridors, and a conversation about records that had become something else, and then had pressed the pen to the paper because the alternative was something he could not afford. He thought about her chin level, and her eyes fixed above the crowd, and the particular quality of her stillness, which was not defeat. He had seen defeat. That was not what she had looked like. The door opened. Peter came back much faster than expected. "That was quick," Kalen said, without turning from the window. "I didn't go to the records office, sir." Peter's voice had a quality Kalen had not heard from him before, something careful in it. "I spoke with Riordan directly. He was in the barracks. I thought it would be faster." And? The full report was different from the summary Elder Vasek presented. A pause. Riordan included a detail that was not in the briefing version. Kalen turned from the window. He noted, Peter said, looking at a point slightly to the left of Kalen's shoulder, that when he observed her, she appeared to be in the early stages of another pause. He used the phrase, "in a changed condition." He was not more specific in writing, but when I asked him to clarify, sir, he said that he believed she was with child. The room was very quiet. Kalen did not move. He stood in the exact center of his council chamber with the afternoon light coming in through the window behind him, and he thought about timing and dates and a conversation in a library that had become something else, and he thought about a political engagement and an exile decree and an elder's voice saying, "This is the cleanest solution," and he thought about the word settled and what it meant to look settled when your whole life had been removed from you in 11 minutes. He thought that Vasek had known, had received the full report, had read the word changed, had removed it from the summary and said nothing. He thought about why a man would do that. He thought about the answer. It arrived with the particular clarity of something that should have been obvious and wasn't, until it was. "Where is Riordan now?" he said. "Barracks, sir." "Tell him to stay there. Tell no one what you asked him." Kalen moved toward the door. "And Peter." "Sir? Find me someone I trust to go back to the Outer Lands. Not one of Vasek's scouts. Someone from before his time on the council. Someone who remembers my father's guard." Peter thought for a moment. "Marcus," he said. "He's been with the palace since before your father's reign." "Get Marcus, tonight." "Yes, sir." Kalen walked out of the council chamber and down the corridor toward the east wing and stopped in front of the locked door and stood there with his hand against the wood and his jaw tight and thought about decisions. He thought, "I was decisive." He thought, "I was wrong." These two things had coexisted in him for the past months as a kind of background noise he had been determined to ignore. They coexisted now differently, louder, with a specific urgency that did not allow for ignoring. He took his hand off the door. He went to find Vasek. Not to confront him, not yet. He was not a man who moved before he had the full shape of something. But he had questions now, and he needed to watch Vasek's face when he asked them, because Vasek was a careful man who had always had answers prepared, and sometimes a prepared answer, delivered a half-second too quickly, told you more than an unprepared one. He walked through the palace corridors with the particular purpose of a man who has decided something new, and the guards he passed stepped out of his way without being asked, and the attendants averted their eyes, and the palace around him went on being solid and permanent and indifferent. It was only his direction through it that had changed. He found Vasek in the records corridor, reviewing documents with two junior clerks. When the elder looked up and saw the Alpha's face, something moved behind his eyes, very fast and very controlled. He dismissed the clerks with a gesture. "My king," Vasek said. "The Eastern Affairs briefing," Kalen said. "The scout report from Riordan." "Yes, I included the relevant detail." "Was that the full report?" A pause. Exactly the right length for someone who had been asked a question they expected, which was itself an answer. "It was a summary of the key operational findings, sir. The raw reports often contain speculation that isn't useful at the briefing level. What did Riordan observe that you didn't include?" Another pause, slightly longer. Vasek looked at him with steady eyes and said, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had been managing information for a very long time, "He mentioned that the woman appeared physically well. I omitted it because it was irrelevant to the patrol strategy discussion. He said more than that. He made an observation that I considered speculative, and therefore not appropriate for a formal briefing." Kalen looked at him. He had looked at this man across council tables for 7 years. He had trusted this man's judgment through 17 separate governance crises. He had leaned on this man's knowledge of pack law more times than he could count, and Vasek had always had the answer, always had the precedent, always had the document. He thought, I have been leaning on a wall that someone was hollowing out from the inside. I see, Kalen said. The steadiness in Vasik's eyes shifted, very slightly. The Alpha King's voice, when it was flat like that, was not a good sign for the person on the receiving end of it. Every senior palace member knew this. If there's an issue with the briefing format, Vasik began, I can certainly revise my process. That won't be necessary, Kalen said. I'm going to review the raw reports directly for the next several weeks. Patrick can handle the formatting. Patrick was the groundskeeper. He had no connection to council affairs. Vasik's expression flickered. Patrick handles the gardens. Patrick is meticulous. Kalen turned. Thank you for your time, Elder. He walked away. Behind him, he heard the quiet sound of Vasik standing very still, which was louder than most sounds, in its way. The corridors were long. He walked them without hurrying. He thought about the exile decree in the East Wing and a child he had not known about until 40 minutes ago. And he thought about the distance between here and the outer lands, and the distance between a decision and its consequences. And he thought that in governance, the gap between those two things was often exactly large enough for a great deal of damage to be done. He reached his own quarters. He closed the door. He stood in the center of the room and let himself, for the first time in months, feel what was there. It was not simple. It was not anything close to simple. But it was real, and he had been avoiding real things for long enough that the encounter was clarifying in a way that was not comfortable but was necessary. He had made decisions. Some of them were his. Some of them, he was beginning to understand, had been made for him while wearing the appearance of his own. He was going to need to address both kinds. He sat down at his desk and picked up a pen and thought about what, exactly, he owed. He thought about the answer for a very long time. Outside, the last of the East Wing roses finally finished dying, and Patrick stood in the garden with his pruning shears and his careful eyes and did not mention it to anyone at all. 3 floors below, in the records room, Elder Vasik stood alone with the door closed and looked at the document in his hands without reading it. He was a patient man. He had built everything he had on patience, on the understanding that power accrued to the person willing to wait the longest and work the smallest angles. He had moved carefully. He had moved over years. He had placed each stone where he needed it. The problem with a long and careful structure was that it had many components, and any one of them, under the right pressure, could crack. He thought about what the Alpha's face had looked like in the corridor. He thought about the scout. He thought about what Reardon might have said in an unsanctioned conversation. He thought about the woman in the outer lands. He needed to move faster than he had planned. Speed was not his preferred mode of operation, but preference was a luxury of a different kind of situation. He set the document down and went to find his personal courier and gave him a message that was short and specific and was not written in a language that could be read by anyone else who might happen to find it. The courier left the palace through the servants' entrance an hour before dark. Vasik went to dinner. He ate well. He spoke pleasantly to his neighbors at the long table. He laughed once at a remark made by council member Petra that was genuinely rather funny. He was a patient man. He thought, this is still manageable. He thought, she will not reach him before I reach her. He thought this with the confidence of someone who had always been one step ahead. What he did not know, could not know from the information available to him, was that in the eastern forest, a woman who had been taught by a careful father to read a room and trust nothing obvious, had already been 3 steps ahead of him for quite some time. The courier arrived at the edge of the outer lands 3 days before Lena expected anything. It was Colin who saw him first. Colin had taken up a habit of walking the camp perimeter in the early mornings, which he described as stretching his legs, and which everyone in the camp understood to be something more watchful. He was not built for combat in any dramatic sense, but he had sharp eyes and good instincts, and when he came back inside the camp fence at dawn and went directly to Mira without stopping for breakfast, people noticed. Lena was already awake. She was sitting near the fire with Aldrich, going through what she knew about the Ironvale Council's structure and testing it against what Aldrich remembered from the records. It was painstaking work, the kind that required holding many small facts in careful relation to each other, and she was good at it, in the same way her father had been good at it, by nature and by practice. She looked up when Colin came in. She read his face. She said, to Aldrich, "Give me a moment." She crossed to where Mira and Colin stood. Mira had her arms crossed, which was not her usual resting posture. Colin was describing direction of approach, single rider, pack colors visible on the horse gear. Ironvale, Lena said. Yes, Colin said. Single rider means a message, not a patrol. She thought quickly. Is he coming toward the camp specifically or moving through the area? Moving through. as far as I could tell, but his direction would take him past the eastern ridge. Colin looked at her. If he's following the road, he'll miss the camp. If he's following a scent trail, he won't. Lena looked at Mira. Can you make the camp hard to smell? Mira raised an eyebrow. That's not as impossible as it sounds, but it takes time we may not have. What would make a message courier stop before reaching his destination? A pause. Then Colin said, slowly, someone intercepting the message before he delivers it. That's dangerous, Mira said. It's more dangerous not to know what the message says. Lena looked at them both. I'm not suggesting anything violent. I'm suggesting someone meet him on the road and explain that the camp he's looking for doesn't exist here. She paused. And if he has something written on him, that it might be worth reading before he goes back. Mira and Colin exchanged a look. It was a long look, the kind between people who have worked together long enough to have entire conversations and glances. Owen, Mira said finally. He looks like the kind of person you don't argue with on a forest road. Owen, when consulted, shrugged enormously and said, I'll go. He went. Lena waited. She was not good at waiting. She was better at it than she had been 2 months ago, because the Outer Lands life had taught her that urgency was only useful when applied to something you could actually affect, but she was not good at it. She helped Della with the morning food preparation and listened to the Barrow boys argue about something, and watched the camp operate around her and kept one part of her mind on the eastern ridge. Owen came back in an hour. He was carrying a sealed packet. He was cooperative, Owen said, with the tone of a man who was being diplomatic about a conversation that had involved a significant height and weight differential. He's gone back the way he came. I told him the eastern camps had moved south last month, which was easy enough to make believable. He handed the packet to Lena. She looked at the seal. It was not the Alpha King's seal. She had seen that seal. She knew what it looked like. This was simpler. A personal seal. A letter rather than an official document. She broke it. The message inside was short. It was written in the same hand as the note in her pack, and the connection hit her before she had finished reading the first line. Same hand, different person from Aldrich. Someone else inside the palace. 2 contacts, not 1. She read it twice. Vasek knows you carry the child. He has given an order. 3 hunters. They will leave within the week. Run south, not east. The eastern road is watched. No signature. She folded it and held it and thought. Good or bad, Mira said. Lena looked up. The whole camp was watching her, or trying not to appear to be watching her. Someone is trying to help me, she said, and someone is trying to very much not help me. Which one got the message there first? The helpful one, this time. She looked at the packet in her hands, but not by much. She spent the next hour sitting with Mira and Aldrich and Colin and working through it. 3 hunters, a week's lead, maybe less if Vasek moved faster than expected. The eastern road watched, which matched Aldrich's assessment that scouts had already been deployed. South is the Fenwick territory, Aldrich said. Neutral ground. No pack holds it. The terrain is difficult, which works for or against, depending on how much they know about the area. Do you know the area? Lena asked. Well enough. I traveled through it twice. He looked at his hands. It's hard going for someone in your condition. I'm not made of something breakable, Lena said. He did not argue with this. He had, in the weeks since joining the camp, learned which of Lena's statements were openings for discussion and which were conclusions. Colin said, if we move the whole camp, we leave tracks. 3 hunters and a week's lead. That's manageable for 1 person. For a camp of 9 people and 2 children, it becomes harder. I'm not asking anyone to come with me, Lena said. The fire crackled. Around it, 8 people said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. No one in this camp, Mira said finally, is going to let you walk into the Fenwick territory alone, and pregnant, and with hunters 3 days behind you. I'm not asking. I know you're not asking. We're not being asked, we're telling. Mira looked around the circle. The camp moves. We've moved before. We'll move again. She stood up. Della, which of the structures can we take? Della assessed the buildings with her experienced eye. The 3 tents. The cooking gear. We leave the permanent structures. Good. Owen, how long to break the tents down? 2 hours if everyone helps. Mira looked at the Barrow boys. You 2 are carrying your own weight today. The boys straightened with the particular seriousness of children who have been given a real responsibility. Start now, Mira said. The camp became immediately purposeful, not chaotic, just focused. Lena stood in the middle of it and watched people she had known for only 2 months dismantle the home they had built and prepare to move it, on her behalf, without complaint or negotiation. and she felt something that she could not let herself feel fully right now because feeling it fully would use up time she needed for other things. She filed it away in a pocket she was going to have to empty soon. She went to help with the tents. 2 hours later, the camp was packed. 3 tents, collapsed and rolled, cooking pots, blankets, tools, food stores, all of it distributed between 8 adults in packs that were heavy but manageable. She looked at the space where the camp had been, a circle in the earth, fire coals, still faintly warm, flattened grass, rope marks in the soil where tent stakes had been. It looked like nothing. It looked like a place where nothing had ever happened. That was correct. That was what you wanted. She shouldered her pack and looked at Mira, who was already facing south. "How far to the first good cover?" Lena asked. 6 hours at a steady pace. Mira looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. "Can you do 6 hours?" "I can do 6 hours." "Then let's go." They went. The forest was dense in the southern direction, which was an advantage. Tracks dispersed in dense growth. Scent trails became harder to follow and broken repeatedly by water crossings, of which there were several in the first 2 hours. Mira knew routes that Lena would never have found on her own, paths that moved through the landscape without announcing themselves. Della walked beside Lena for most of the first hour and said nothing, and occasionally offered her a piece of dried fruit from a pocket, which Lena accepted without comment. The Barrow boys flanked Owen in the center of the group and actually were carrying their own weight, the larger boy helping the smaller when the ground was rough. Colin fell into step beside her in the second hour. "You doing all right?" he said. "Better than yesterday," she said, which was true. Yesterday she had not known the shape of the threat. Today she did. Known threats were manageable in a way unknown ones were not. "That's a reasonable standard." He moved over a root without looking down. "Your father's colleague, Aldrich. He told me something about why you were exiled." "He shouldn't have. He didn't tell me details. He just said that the reason given wasn't the real reason." Colin paused. "I'm not asking about the real reason. I just wanted to say that people in this camp have all been displaced by things that weren't what they appeared. You're not unique in that." She looked at him. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be true. Comfort is secondary." He looked ahead. "But also, yes, a little." She almost smiled. She thought about letting herself smile and then did, briefly, because the situation was difficult enough without denying herself the small things. They walked. At the 4th hour, Mira called a rest at the edge of a stream. Everyone sat and drank, and Della handed out food with the efficiency of someone who had moved camps many times and knew exactly how to restore energy quickly without wasting time. Lena sat on a rock beside the stream and listened to the water, and thought about the 3 hunters who would leave the palace within the week, and the direction they would be told to travel, and what they would find when they got there. She thought about Vasek. She thought about the message and its handwriting, and who inside the palace had 2 contacts trying to move information to her while remaining invisible themselves. 2 separate contacts, or the same one using 2 different methods. She couldn't be certain. She thought about Kalen Voss sitting in his council chamber with Vasek at his left shoulder. She thought about what he had been told, and what had been kept from him, and what would happen when the 2 came into contact with each other. She put her hand against her middle. 4 months now, according to Nessa's count. She was beginning to show, which was one of the reasons that running was preferable to staying. The showing was still subtle. In a week it would be less subtle. In a month it would be unmistakable. Everything had a window, and the windows were all closing at the same rate. She stood up. "Ready," she said. Mira looked at her. "We've got another 2 hours. Then we should use them." Mira studied her for a moment with those measuring eyes. Then she turned and started moving again without another word. The camp followed. Lena followed with them, walking south through trees that were beginning to thin where the Fenwick territory began, and she thought about her father's careful hands and his unmarked crates, and she thought that being careful only goes so far when someone has decided to move against you, and she thought that possibly, just possibly, the answer to careful and far was not to be more careful but to change directions entirely. She thought about what she needed. She needed to get to somewhere with walls and witnesses and people who owed no loyalty to Vasek. She needed to be there before the hunters caught her trail. And she needed to do something she had been refusing to consider for the past 2 months, because considering it meant accepting that the situation had changed into something for which the old rules no longer applied. She needed to send word to the palace. Not to Vasek, not through official channels, to someone who had access to the Alpha King directly, and who had been watching things quietly, and who had, apparently, already been trying to reach her. She needed to answer back. She walked through the trees with her pack on her shoulders and her hand occasionally moving to her middle when the ground was uneven, and she thought about how to write a message that said exactly what needed saying in a way that could not be intercepted and understood before it reached the right hands. She was still thinking when the camp stopped for the night, and the tents went up in a new arrangement in new terrain, and the fire was built low and carefully, and the Barrow boys fell asleep before dinner was finished, and Della covered them with a blanket without waking them. She sat with the low fire and wrote the message in her head. It was very short. Her father had taught her that important things could usually be said in fewer words than people thought. In the morning, she asked Mira for paper. Mira brought it without asking what it was for. Lena sat down and wrote 7 words. She thought, 2 could manage that game. The 7 words she wrote were, "Tell him what he was not told." She folded the paper small and looked at it for a moment. She needed a way to move it. She needed someone who could reach inside the palace without being a person connected to her, someone whose arrival at the palace would not register as unusual, someone who knew how to move through that kind of space without drawing notice. She went to Aldrich. She said, "Who gave you the original note? The one in my pack? Who assembled the pack and put it in?" Aldrich thought. "A woman on the supply staff. She has access to the exile preparation supplies. Her name is Grace. She's worked in that role for 12 years. Is she Vasic's?" No. She was appointed before Vasic held his current position. She is not aligned with anyone, as far as I know. She simply does her job. And the second contact? The message about the hunters. Same handwriting as my note. Aldrich frowned. "Grace," he said after a moment, "I believe. I did not know she had made contact again." She did. Lena looked at the folded paper. "She's the one inside the palace who's been trying to help me. Then she's taking an enormous risk." "I know." Lena held the paper. "I need to find a way to get a message back to her without a courier that Vasek can intercept." She thought about this for the rest of the morning. It was Colin who provided the answer, though not directly. He mentioned at midday that Nessa the healer had a regular route. She visited multiple camps through the territory on a monthly circuit. She was not connected to any pack. She moved freely. She was trusted in places where strangers were not. Lena looked at him. "When does she next pass through the palace town?" "She doesn't go to the palace," Colin said. "But she visits the lower market town, 2 days from here. There are always palace staff in the market." Lena thought about Grace, working her supply job for 12 years, doing her shopping in the market like anyone else. Does Nessa know her way through the market? "Nessa knows everyone in the market," Colin said. "She's been coming through for 15 years. Lena thought for another moment. Then she said, "Can you take me to Nessa? She won't be at her next stop for 3 days." Then we walk toward her next stop and we meet her on the road. She stood up. "Can you track her route?" Colin looked at her steadily for a moment. He had, she had noticed, a way of considering things properly before speaking that she found useful. "Yes," he said. "I know the general route. I can find her." "Good." She looked at the paper in her hand. "Then let's go." The 3-day journey to intercept Nessa was not comfortable, and was not entirely safe, and Lena spent it being practical about both of those facts. The terrain was broken and hilly, and her body was making its own demands now with increasing frequency, and she managed them one at a time, which was the only approach that worked. Colin was a good traveling companion. He did not comment on difficulties that were being handled. He did not try to make conversation during the stretches that required all available attention for navigation. He produced food from his pack at intervals that turned out to correspond with precisely when Lena was thinking about food, which she chose to attribute to practical camp sense rather than any more particular attentiveness on his part. On the second night, sitting beside a small fire, he said, "What was the palace like? The inside, I mean." She thought about it. "Complicated," she said. "It looked one way, and it was another way. The outside of it was all ceremony and formality and everyone in their correct place. The inside of it, where the work actually happened, was much messier. People making decisions in corridors. Alliances formed over record-keeping. Power that had nothing to do with rank. Sounds like most places. I suppose it does." She looked at the fire. The difference was that no one was allowed to say it was that way. You had to pretend the ceremony was real while the actual thing was happening underneath it. "Did you mind that?" She considered. "I minded when the ceremony was used to cover the actual thing from the people it was being done to." She paused. "I didn't see that clearly enough while I was in it. You see it now." "I see it now." She leaned back on her hands. "My father saw it. He was trying to do something about it quietly. I think he ran out of time." Colin was quiet. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am not going to run out of time, but I need to move faster than I have been. You've been moving, he said. You just weren't able to run yet. You needed to know which direction. She looked at him. You're more perceptive than you let people know. He looked at the fire. I find it useful. She did not disagree. They found Nessa the following afternoon, on the road between two small villages, sitting on the back of a patient old horse with her bag of medicine across the saddle. She greeted Colin with the ease of someone who had known him in passing for years, and she greeted Lena with a sharper attention. You look better than you should, given what you've been through, Nessa said. I've been eating properly, Lena said. I can tell. Good. Nessa looked at her steadily. What do you need? Lena held out the folded paper. I need this to reach someone in the palace market. Her name is Grace. She works supply. She will know who to give it to. Nessa took the paper without looking at it. I go through the market in 5 days. I know. I thought of you because you're the least visible option. Nessa considered this with a slight tilt of her head that suggested she found it both accurate and gently amusing. I've been told I'm invisible. I've always found that the trick is to be so consistently present that people stop registering you as new information. She tucked the paper into an interior pocket. I'll find Grace. Thank you. Don't thank me. Go back to camp and rest. Nessa looked at her with the focused attention of the experienced healer. You're doing well. Keep doing what you're doing. Eat. Move carefully. Don't take unnecessary risks for at least, she paused, assessing, another month. The risks are not optional, Lena said. I know. I said unnecessary. Nessa looked at her. Do you understand the difference? Lena thought about 3 hunters and a 7-word message and a man inside a palace who had not been told what he needed to know. Yes, she said. I understand the difference. Nessa nodded. She said goodbye to Colin. She turned her horse and continued down the road. Lena watched her go. Colin stood beside her and said nothing. The paper was in Nessa's pocket. The message was moving. In 5 days it would be in Grace's hands. And then, if Grace trusted the path she had been building, in the right hands after that. Lena breathed in the cold air and looked at the road ahead. One thing at a time. Mornings were better for figuring. But afternoons, she was learning, were better for moving. She turned toward camp. They walked. The 3 hunters left the palace on a Tuesday. Lena did not know this until Thursday, which was a difference of 2 days and approximately 40 miles, and both of those numbers mattered. The information came through Aldrich, who had a contact of his own inside the palace he had not mentioned until now. He mentioned it Thursday morning with the expression of someone who had been weighing the cost of disclosure against the cost of secrecy, and had finally concluded that secrecy was no longer the safer choice. His name is Henry, Aldrich said. He was a junior record keeper when I was a clerk. He has been watching for developments. Lena looked at him steadily. How long have you been in contact with Henry? Since I arrived here. He met her eyes. I did not tell you because I did not want to complicate your decisions with information whose reliability I hadn't verified. I've now verified it through 2 other sources. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about whether to be angry about the withholding, and concluded that it was a reasonable judgment call under the circumstances. She also concluded she would like to know in future when he was exercising judgment calls on her behalf. She said so. He nodded. Fair. I'll tell you what he sent. The 3 hunters were experienced. Their names, according to Henry, were Garrett the Younger, who was not her father but happened to share the name in a coincidence Lena found briefly and bitterly ironic, a man called Steele whose primary skill was tracking over difficult terrain, and a woman called Bryn who was reportedly the most capable of the 3, and who had carried out 2 previous orders of this kind without incident. 3 hunters, 2 days ahead of them, moving east, per their last known direction, which meant they had not yet received word that the eastern route was watched and would need to be corrected. Can Henry get word to anyone to delay them? Lena said. Not directly. He's a clerk. He can't affect troop movements. Aldrich paused. But he sent something else that is more important. He produced a folded paper from inside his coat. It was not from Henry. The handwriting on the outside was Grace's, which she knew now like a familiar thing. But when she opened it, the handwriting inside was different, neat, controlled. The hand of someone who had spent years governing from a desk. She read it. It was short, 3 lines. The order can be recalled. I am working toward that, but I need a formal record of what was withheld from me. If you have documentation, send it through this channel. I will wait a week. No signature. She did not need one. Her hands were steady. She had not expected them to be steady, and they were, which was interesting information about herself. She looked at Aldrich. The original decree. Your records. Do you have copies? I made copies before I left. I have them. And the second signature. Can you attest to it? In writing, yes. I was in the records room when I saw it. I noted the date and time in a personal document. He paused. It would be better with a witness to the original, but I am the only person I know of who saw it directly. Your word against his. Yes, but I am a former council clerk with documentation, and he is an elder with a great deal to lose. Aldrich met her eyes. The weight is not equal in the way Vasek would want it to be. Lena thought about the week the message said was available. She thought about 2 days and 40 miles and 3 hunters with experienced tracking skills. She thought about Nessa having delivered the first message to Grace, and Grace having apparently gotten it to someone who responded. She thought, the channel works. The question is what goes through it and when. How quickly can you copy everything relevant onto fresh paper? She asked. 3 hours. Start now. She stood up. I'm going to talk to Mira. Mira was near the camp's water supply, which she always was in the mornings. The camp had found a good stream at their current position, and Mira was assessing its flow the way she assessed everything, with systematic attention. Hunters left Tuesday, Lena said. We need to move again, but I also need to stay close enough to the market road to get documents to Nessa within 3 days. Mira absorbed this without visible stress. The market road runs north-south about 4 miles east of here. We can move parallel to it while keeping out of the main travel corridor. She was quiet for a moment. What are the documents for? Sending them to the palace. Another pause. You're making contact. He made contact first. I'm answering. Mira looked at the stream. Is that wise? I think it's necessary, Lena said. I think Vasek is going to move against Kalen eventually, not just against me. Someone who builds what he's built doesn't stop at an exile decree. And the only thing that slows Vasek down is the king having information that Vasek hasn't shaped. And the hunters? If the order is recalled before they reach me, there are no hunters. Lena looked at her. That's the best outcome. And if it isn't recalled? Lena thought about Bryn, who had carried out 2 previous orders of this kind without incident. She thought about Owen, who was large and calm, and very good at appearing in a forest road, with a quality of presence that discouraged argument. She thought about 7 adults, a healer's certificate from Nessa confirming the child, and 2 days of lead time. Then were more complicated to deal with than 3 hunters expect, she said. Mira looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, I'll get Owen. Aldrich spent 3 hours working through his documents with meticulous care, copying relevant sections onto clean paper, and organizing them in the order they needed to be understood. He was, Lena observed, very good at this. He had the habits of the diligent record keeper, which was both his limitation as a person of action and his strength as a source of evidence. Colin organized the camp for movement. Owen reviewed the perimeter. Della prepared a travel pack for the next leg. The Barrow boys, who had adapted to this life with the easy resilience of children who had been born into it, helped without being directed. She wrote a second message to accompany the documents. It was longer than 7 words this time, but not much. She included the scout report discrepancy, which Aldrich had gotten from Henry. She included the detail about Elder Vasek and the exile pack, which Aldrich could attest to. She included 1 sentence that she had not planned to include and then wrote anyway, because it was true, and because the situation had passed the point where withholding true things served any purpose. The sentence said, I am not doing this for myself, but there is a child who has done nothing to anyone, and I intend to see to it that the child's existence is not used as a weapon by anyone on either side of this. She read it back. It was clear. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. She folded it with the documents and sealed it with the small piece of wax Della produced from somewhere practical, the way Della produced everything. She handed it to Colin. Nessa, as fast as you can. He took it without drama. I'll be back by tomorrow night. He left. The camp moved. They walked parallel to the market road, 4 miles east, through terrain that was broken enough to hide them and open enough to move through. Lena walked in the middle of the group, which was Mira's practical arrangement for the person most in need of being surrounded by other people. She did not comment on this arrangement. It was sensible. She accepted sensible things. By mid-afternoon they had covered 12 miles and the hunters, wherever they were still moving toward the eastern route, misdirected. A narrow window, but a real one. She thought about the documents in Colin's pack and the message folded with them, and the sentence she had added at the end. She thought about what Kalen Voss would do with them. She had been trying not to build an image of who he was behind the closed face. She had been trying to hold him at the specific distance of a man who had done specific things, because that was the accurate and manageable version. But in the past few days, the version of him that Aldrich described, and Henry's information implied, was somewhat more complicated than a man whose primary characteristic was indifference. Henry had told Aldrich that the king had personally reviewed the original scout report within a week of the briefing, that he had spoken to Reardon directly, that he had been asking about the records, that his behavior in council had shifted in a way that the clerks were quietly remarking on. Someone was doing something inside that palace. She tried not to let herself find that hopeful. Hope was a more expensive emotion than it appeared, because it raised the cost of disappointment. But she thought about what she knew of him, not the ceremony of him. The person she had spoken with in the East Wing library on a late night, who had come in looking for something, and who had stayed to talk about record-keeping, and then about other things, and who had laughed at something she said with a quality of surprise that suggested he had not been expecting to laugh. She thought about the East Wing being sealed and the doors being locked and the groundskeeper watching the roses. She thought, I don't know this man well enough to trust him. She also thought, I know him well enough to know he was not the only author of everything that happened. She walked. The camp stopped at the edge of a natural hollow as the light faded. Good cover, fresh water nearby. Owen went to the perimeter. Della started the fire in the approved low and covered way. Lena sat down. She was tired in the particular way of a person who had been moving her body through hard country, while simultaneously moving her mind through harder territory, and both kinds of tired were real and both needed the same thing, which was rest and food and the specific relief of people around you who were on your side. She looked at the camp, Owen returning, Della at the fire, the Barrow boys sitting together, the smaller one asleep already against his brother's shoulder, Aldrich reviewing his notes in the last of the light, Mira doing the quiet calculations that occupied her in the evenings, looking at what they had and what they needed and adjusting accordingly. All of this, moving for her. She thought again about the pocketful of things she was not allowing herself to feel yet. She thought about her father and his careful hands. She thought, I will do this correctly. Not for herself. Not entirely for the child, though the child was always present in her thoughts now, a specific fact rather than an abstract one, but for the thing her father had seen on the council and worried about and worked against quietly for years, the thing that had eventually, she believed more and more clearly, taken him from her. She was going to do this correctly, and she was going to do it completely, and she was not going to stop until it was done. She ate dinner. She helped clean up. She went to the tent. She slept without difficulty. The child moved once in the night, a small emphatic motion, as if to confirm a position. I know, she said quietly to the dark. We're working on it. She slept again. Colin came back the following evening, as he had said he would. He handed Mira an apple he had clearly picked up in the market, handed Owen a length of rope that had been on the supply list, and sat down by the fire with the particular manner of someone who has completed a task without incident and would like a meal before discussing it. Lena waited until he had eaten most of his food. Then she said, Nessa. Found her at her usual spot in the market. She already knew which stall Grace shops at. He looked at his cup. She said the path has been used before. That Grace has been moving small items through the market to various people for the past year. Past year, Lena said. That's what Nessa said. He looked at her. Apparently your information network predates your awareness of it by some time. She thought about her father. She thought about 12 years on the supply staff. She thought about food in unmarked crates. She thought he was building something. He was building it quietly, the way he did everything, and it was not finished when he died, and the people he had built it with were still there, still moving, still waiting for someone to use it correctly. She put both hands around her cup and felt its warmth. My father, she said quietly. It looks that way, Aldrich said from across the fire. He had been listening. His expression was careful. I told you I had suspicions about the network. This confirms the shape of them. He never told me. He was protecting you. Aldrich paused. He was also waiting. I think he was waiting for the right moment. I think Vasek moved against him before the moment arrived. The fire crackled. The Barrow boys were asleep in the tent. Owen sat like a large and peaceful anchor at the edge of the firelight. Della had found some mending and was working through it. Mira said, What does this change? It changes the network's history, Lena said. It doesn't change what we need to do with it. She looked at the fire. It means there are more people inside who know what this channel is for, which means fewer chances to intercept your message before it reaches the right hands. Yes, she breathed out. And it means Vasek has been operating inside a structure he doesn't know exists. This thought sat in the air for a moment. Della looked up from her mending. That's a useful kind of advantage, she said. The kind that only works once. Use it correctly. It was one of Della's longer speeches. Everyone around the fire registered this. "I intend to," Lena said. She thought about the message Colin had delivered. She thought about the sentence she had added at the end, the child, and the refusal to be used as a weapon by anyone on either side. She thought about Kalen Voss reading it, and what he would understand from it, and what he would do. She thought about what she knew of him, carefully, without hope, just as information. He had governed a difficult pack efficiently. He had made the decision to exile her quickly, and she did not think now that it had been entirely his decision. But she also did not think he had resisted it adequately. He had sealed the East Wing library. He had reviewed the original scout report. He had spoken directly with the scout. He had been asking about records. These were the actions of someone who suspected they had been managed. What a person did when they discovered they had been managed told you more about them than almost anything else. She thought, "I will find out." She looked at the fire for a long time after everyone else had gone to sleep, and she thought about her father, who had built a network in unmarked crates and careful silences, and had not lived to use it. She was going to use it. She was going to use all of it. And she was going to do it carefully, because careful was in her blood, and if that caution was sometimes the slower path, it was also the one that did not double back on itself when the ground shifted. She went to sleep. In the morning she woke to Owen standing at the tent entrance. He said, "Someone's coming." She was up before he finished the sentence. Owens, someone turned out to be a single person, on foot, coming from the northeast, at a pace that suggested purpose rather than wandering. She was a woman, middle-aged, wearing ordinary traveling clothes with a hood pulled up and moving through the forest with the particular care of someone who knew how to follow a route without leaving obvious tracks. Lena reached the camp edge and stopped. The woman stopped at the same time. She pushed back her hood. "Grace," Lena said. The supply clerk looked at her with eyes that had the exhausted alertness of someone who had not slept in 2 days, and who had covered significant ground on those 2 days. She was not a young woman, but she was clearly a capable one, and there was something in her face that was also, around the edges, grief. "I knew your father," Grace said. "I know," Lena said. "Come inside. Tell me what's happened." Grace sat down by the fire, accepted tea with both hands, and told her. The message had reached the right hands within 6 hours. The response had been faster than expected. But Vasek had moved in parallel, not knowing the message had gone, acting on his own timeline. He had given the 3 hunters a specific piece of additional information that changed their route. "They're not going east anymore," Grace said. "They know the camp moved south. Someone in the market, I don't know who, told them about a group of wolves moving south with supplies." She looked at Lena directly. "They're 2 days behind you." 2 days. The same gap she had thought she had in the other direction. "And the recall order?" Lena said. Grace hesitated. "He is working toward it," she said carefully. "He's moving through proper channels because he needs documentation to move against Vasek, and he can't act on one without the other. He can't recall the order without also addressing how the order was given, and he can't address how the order was given without the documentation." She paused. "He said to tell you." She stopped. "What?" Grace looked at her. "He said to tell you he is aware that time is not something you have in surplus, and that he is aware that his timeline and yours are not the same thing, and that he is sorry for the gap between them." Lena sat with this for a moment. She thought about what it would cost a man who did not use that word often to send it in a message. She pressed it down. She could not let it be information she used yet. It was genuine, she thought. She believed it was genuine. But genuine and sufficient were 2 different things. "Where is the safest ground for the next 2 days?" she said to Mira. Mira was already thinking. 3 miles southwest. Old settlement ruins, stone walls, 3 sides standing, defensible. Can we hold it with what we have? Owen crossed his arms. "Yes. Then we go there and we wait." She looked at Grace. "And you stay with us." Grace looked briefly startled. "I should go back, if I'm missing from the palace. If you go back right now, Vasek will know the channel was used and he'll close it." Lena met her eyes. "You come with us. You're part of the documentation. You're a witness. And you're safer here than there until the order is recalled." Grace looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father would have handled this exactly this way." "I know," Lena said. "Move." The ruins were exactly what Mira had described. 3 stone walls standing on the 4th side of a square that had once been something useful. Possibly a way station. Possibly a small holding. The roof was long gone. The floor was earth, hard-packed. The walls were old enough to be solid and high enough to matter. They moved into it at midday and spent the afternoon turning it from a ruin into something more deliberate. Owen assessed the structural integrity of the walls with the focused attention of a man who understood load-bearing. He declared 2 of the 3 walls sound and the third questionable, and identified which way someone approaching from the northeast would likely come, given the natural corridors of the terrain. Lena watched this and thought, 3 hunters, 2 days, 1 set of walls. She was very clear about the math. She was also clear that this was the position from which she was most likely to survive the next 48 hours, and that survival remained the primary objective until the situation changed. Grace spent the first afternoon going through everything she knew in careful sequence, prompted by Aldrich, who was an excellent interviewer because he knew which details mattered and how to ask for them without leading. She had worked in the supply corridors for 12 years. She had begun moving information through the market network 2 years after Garrett Calloway came to her and said, very quietly, that he was worried about the direction of certain things and asked if she would be willing to notice what came through the supply records. She had been willing. She had noticed a great deal over 8 years. The falsified illness report, Aldrich said. Do you have evidence of that? Grace opened the inner lining of her traveling bag. She had sewn a flat pocket there, invisible unless you knew to look. She produced documents that were folded thin and carefully kept. I copied the original before the replacement was substituted in the records. The dates don't match. I also have 2 supply manifests showing materials that were delivered to the medical wing during your father's illness that were not consistent with the treatment listed in his official care record. Lena looked at these documents. Her hands were steady. Her father had been careful. He had built careful people around him. He had died carefully, which was to say that he had died in a way that looked simple and left enough behind for the people he had built to continue. She thought about that for a long time in silence. Then she said, Grace, how did my father know he was running out of time? Grace was quiet for a moment. He told me, about a month before he got ill, that Vasek had made an offer. He did not tell me what the offer was, but he said he had refused it. He said that refusing it meant Vasek knew where he stood, and that Vasek now needed him removed. She looked at Lena. He told me to watch the supply records very carefully from then on. He knew. He knew something was coming. He did not know exactly what. Lena folded her hands in her lap and looked at the stone wall across from her. It was old and solid, and had been standing long before any of the people in this ruin had been born. He kept me away from it, she said, to protect me. Yes. And then after he was gone, I was the most exposed person in the pack. An Omega without a father, without a senior family member, without political protection. Yes, Grace's voice was gentle. Vasek did not need to move against you immediately. He only needed to wait until it was convenient. The Bond night had made it convenient. She saw this now. The circumstances had given Vasek something he could use, a reason to move Lena out of the palace with a justification that appeared clean, and he had moved. The exile decree with the second signature was the evidence that the move had been Vasek's as much as or more than the king's. She thought about sitting in the library late at night and a conversation that had become something else, and she thought about how exposed she had been in that corridor between who she was and who she had not protected herself from becoming. And she thought that she was not going to waste the rest of her life on that particular retrospective. She said, tell me the thing that most directly implicates Vasek, not by connection or inference, the most direct evidence. Grace and Aldrich looked at each other. Grace spoke. The second signature on the exile decree. Aldrich witnessed it. I have the original document request, which shows the decree being pulled from archives the day after the king signed it, which is the day the second signature was added. The king's own copy would show the signature. If the king examines his own copy, he has access to his own copy, Lena said. He does, but he would need to know to look for the second signature, and it would need to be pointed out with context. Otherwise it could be passed off as a clerical addition, which is what Vasek will claim. Yes, which is why Aldrich's witness account and the timing documented in the archive request matters. Lena thought. What else? Aldrich set his papers on the ground between them, with the systematic precision of someone organizing evidence for presentation. He had, over the past several days, been quietly brilliant at this. The original exile decree included a charge of conduct unbecoming an Omega Elder's family member, which is a real provision in pack law. But the specific instance cited in the original is dated 3 weeks before I believe it could have occurred, because I have a supply record from that date that shows Lena present at a function she could not have attended if the cited instance were true. He paused. It's a small window, 1 day, but it means the charge was constructed, not observed. Lena stared at him. You have that? I recognized the name of the function when I was reading the decree after it was filed. I went back and checked. When did you go back and check? 3 weeks before I was asked to leave the palace. He met her eyes. I was slow, I'm afraid. I should have connected the dates sooner. She looked at the evidence in front of her. A wrongly dated charge. A falsified illness record. A second signature added after the king had left the document. 2 witnesses and multiple supporting records. It was not enough to destroy Vasek in front of a hostile council. It was enough to give an Alpha King the foundation for an investigation, and an investigation under the direct authority of the Alpha King, rather than through the council Vasek had shaped, was a different matter. The question was getting it there. She looked at Grace. Henry, Freen, can he get documents directly to the king? He's a junior clerk. He's never had direct access. Can he get them to Peter? Grace tilted her head. The personal attendant? He's careful, very loyal. He reviewed Riordan's original report at the king's request. He spoke to the scout directly when the king asked him to. Lena thought. He's already in this. He's been in this since the king started asking questions. Grace looked at Aldrich. He looked at Grace. Something passed between them that was recognition. Henry knows Peter, Grace said slowly. Not well. But there was a period when they both worked night records duty. 2 years ago. Is that enough to approach him? Aldrich thought, with the right framing. If Henry presents it as information the king has already requested and needs to see. He paused. The risk is that Peter goes straight to Vasek. What do we know about Peter's loyalties? He's been with the king's personal service for 2 years. Before that he worked under the chamberlain, who was appointed before Vasek's time on the council. Grace considered. I don't have evidence of his direct loyalty, but I've never seen his name connected to Vasek's office in any supply or record request. Then we operate on the assumption that he's clean until we have evidence otherwise. Lena looked at them both. Henry reaches Peter. Peter gets the documents to the king, and we need this to happen before the 3 hunters reach us. 2 days, Mira said from across the ruin, where she had been listening without comment. Possibly less. Lena looked at the stone wall. We need to move the documents tonight. The market is closed tonight. Not the market, the network. She looked at Grace. You said the path has been used before. Is there anyone on this end who can carry documents into town tonight? Grace thought for a long moment. Then she said, Nessa. Nessa was already 3 miles north of their position, on her monthly circuit. Colin stood up without being asked. I'll find her. Take Owen, Mira said. Owen stood up. He was the kind of person who made decisions look like weather, simply the natural next condition of things. They left. Lena looked at the remaining documents. She spent the next hour with Aldrich and Grace organizing them into the clearest possible sequence, the document that most directly demonstrated the problem at the front, the supporting evidence organized behind it, a single covering note that explained the sequence without interpretation, because interpretation was the king's job, not hers. She wrote the covering note herself. It was 1 paragraph. She wrote it 3 times until it said what it needed to say without 1 extra word. Then she sealed everything together with the wax she still had from the previous delivery. And she held the sealed packet for a moment and thought about what she was handing over. Not just evidence. The entire interior of the network her father had built. The names of people who had been moving quietly for years. All of it. Delivered on the assumption that the man on the receiving end was, underneath the closed face and the bad decisions and the one enormous failure of backbone, a person who would use it correctly. She had spent months not hoping. She let herself hope, briefly and carefully, that she was right. Then she put the hope away and sat with Della and drank tea, and watched the light change on the stone walls of the ruin, and waited for Colin and Owen to come back. They came back at 3 in the morning. Nessa had the packet. She would be in the town by morning. Lena lay down on the earth floor of the ruin and listened to the night sounds of the southern forest, and thought that the next 24 hours would tell her whether her father's careful work had built something strong enough to hold, and whether the man she was relying on was the man she believed him to be. She thought about this clearly and without flinching. She slept. In the palace, at approximately the same time, Peter knocked on the door of the Alpha King's private chamber with a sealed packet in his hand, and an expression that suggested he had not slept either. Kalen opened the door. Peter held out the packet. Henry from Records, sir. He said it was urgent. He said you'd been asking. Kalen looked at the packet. He took it. He looked at the seal. Then he looked at Peter. Stay close, he said. He closed the door. He opened the packet. He read the covering note first, which explained the sequence. Then he read through everything in the order it had been organized, piece by piece, without rushing, because he was a person who believed that rushing through evidence was a way of convincing yourself of things you wanted to believe rather than things that were true. He went through it twice. When he was done, he sat at his desk and looked at the second signature on the copy of his own exile decree that he had pulled from his personal files the week before. The signature he had noticed, and then told himself was clerical, and then kept coming back to. And he understood now what it was and what it meant, and how long it had been there. He thought about Vasek sitting to his left in the council chamber for 7 years. He thought about his own hand on the pen. He thought about the covering note's last line, "I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to look at what is in front of you and decide for yourself what it means." He sat with that for a long time. Then he stood up and opened the door and said, "Peter, wake the council, not Vasek, everyone else." "Sir, it's 3 in the morning." "Yes," Kalen said. "Wake them anyway." The council assembled in the chamber at 4 in the morning, with the particular wariness of people who have been summoned without explanation, and know that no summons at 4 in the morning carries good news. Council member Petra arrived first and arranged herself with the composure she maintained in all circumstances. Councillor Weld arrived second with his reading glasses and an expression suggesting he suspected a governance crisis. 3 others filtered in over the following 10 minutes, each taking their seat and looking at the empty chair at Kalen's left without mentioning it. Vasek's chair. Empty. Kalen stood at the end of the table and waited until they were all present. Then he placed the organized packet from the ruin in the center of the table. "I want each of you to read this," he said. "I want to know what you see. I'm not going to tell you what I see first, because I want your assessment before mine." Petra picked up the first document and began reading. The room was quiet for 20 minutes, while 5 members of his council went through the packet, in the careful way that people go through things when they understand that what they are reading carries consequences. Petra finished first. She set the document down. Her face was composed and completely still. "The second signature," she said. "Is this your archive copy?" "It is." "And Aldrich Fenmore's witness account. He was on council records for 6 years before he left." She looked at the account. "I remember him. He was thorough." "That is my assessment as well." Weld set his reading glasses down. "The dates on the charge used to justify the exile decree," he said. "I was at that function. The one cited. I remember it distinctly because of the Eastern delegation attendance." He looked at the document. "If this record is accurate, the charge could not have occurred on the cited date." "Were you there?" Kalen asked. "The entire delegation was there. It was not a small event." Weld's expression had moved into the territory of a man who is connecting things, and not enjoying what they are forming. Vasek organized the function. The room was quiet. The other 3 council members were reading at different paces. One of them, a woman named Councilmember Dre, who had been on the council for 4 years, looked up when she reached a specific page and said nothing for a long moment. "The illness records," she said finally. "My brother is a physician. I recognize what I'm looking at here." She paused. "These 2 sets of supply records are not consistent with each other. One of them is false." "Which one?" Kalen said. "The treatment record. It lists materials not consistent with the illness on record. The supply manifests show what was actually delivered." She set the document down with the careful movement of someone who is controlling their response. "The treatment on record was not adequate for the illness actually presented." Silence. Kalen waited. Petra was the one who said it. Garrett Calloway's illness was managed in a way that was not intended to allow recovery. No one in the room looked at the empty chair. No one needed to. Kalen looked at the 5 people in front of him. 5 members of his council who had sat in this room with him through 7 years of governance, who had worked alongside Vasek in good faith, who were looking at him now with the particular expressions of people who have just been asked to understand that the ground they stood on was different from the ground they thought they stood on. "I want your formal assessments in writing by morning," he said. "I want each of you to note specifically what you observed in these documents, and what, in your judgment, it indicates." He paused. "I also want your recollection, in writing, of any council decision in the past 3 years, where you had a significant question about the recommendation being presented, and chose not to raise it." This was a harder ask. He saw them understand it. "I'm not asking this to assign blame," he said. "I'm asking it because I need to understand the full shape of what happened in this council. I contributed to it through decisions that were mine. I want all of us to be honest about what we each contributed, including me." Another silence. Longer. Petra said, "Yes, sir." The others nodded. Kalen picked up the recall order he had drafted in the 3 hours between reading the documents and summoning the council. He signed it. "Peter," he said. Peter, who had been waiting by the door, came forward. "Dispatch this immediately," Kalen said. "Take it yourself, not through the standard channel. Find a fast rider. I want it moving before dawn." "Yes, sir." Peter took the order and left. Kalen looked at the council. "I will be speaking with Elder Vasek this morning," he said. "He will not be in this chamber for that conversation. I want you to complete your written assessments before I do." He said nothing more. He walked out. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with his hand against the wall, not for support but for the particular steadiness of a surface that stayed where it was. He thought about the exile decree and the library and everything between those two events. He thought about a paragraph he had read in the covering note that he had gone back to 3 times. He thought about what he owed. He understood that owing something and being able to pay it were not the same thing. He understood that the gap between the two was real and significant, and was not something that could be resolved by wanting. But the gap could be worked. It could be worked directly and honestly and without pretense, and those were the only terms under which it was worth trying. He walked toward Vasek's chamber. The corridor was empty and very quiet, and the torches were burning low at this hour, and he walked through it with the particular purpose of someone who has been decisive in the wrong direction, and is now being decisive in the right one. It was not comfortable. He thought it should not be comfortable. He reached Vasek's door and knocked. He heard the elder wake. He heard the slight delay that was Vasek assessing the hour and the knock and deciding how to arrange himself. The door opened. Vasek looked at him. In the low light, without the council chamber and the ceremonial structure around him, he looked older than Kalen usually perceived. He had arranged his face into the expression of calm authority that he brought to every situation. "My king," he said. "Good morning," Kalen said. "I need your signature on something." He held out the written assessment form he had prepared for the council members. Vasek looked at it. His eyes moved over the text. Something changed in his face, very controlled, very fast. "This is a formal record assessment," Vasek said. "Yes. These questions concern the council's handling of specific decisions." "Correct." A pause. "I'd like to review this with my legal advisor before." "That's your right," Kalen said. "I'll send him to your chamber this morning. In the meantime, you'll remain here." He paused. "That is not a request, Elder." Vasek looked at him. Kalen looked back. Between them, something that had been built over 7 years in the space of a half-second came down. "I see," Vasek said. "I believe you do," Kalen said. He walked away from the door. In the south, in a ruin with 3 stone walls standing, Lena was still asleep. She would wake in 2 hours to the sound of birds in the southern trees and the smell of the fire Mira had started for breakfast, and she would lie on the earth floor and look at the stone ceiling that wasn't there anymore, and think about what today's single decision needed to be. She would not yet know that the recall order was already moving. She would simply wake up and continue, the way she had been continuing. That was, it turned out, the most powerful thing she had been doing all along. The recall order arrived at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Not because it arrived too late. It arrived on the second day, earlier than expected, carried by a fast rider who had covered ground at the pace of a man with a specific and urgent instruction. But the 3 hunters were already in the southern territory by then, already moving along the tree line, and the rider was moving on the road, and those were 2 different corridors through the same landscape. Lena heard them before she saw them. She was outside the ruin, in the tree cover to the west, where she had been walking in the early morning with the deliberate steadiness that had become part of how she managed the days now, movement to keep her body working as it should, attention to keep her mind from feeding on itself. She heard a sound that was the wrong kind of quiet, not natural quiet, managed quiet. The quality of sound that happened when people in a forest were deliberately making less noise than the forest expected of them. She stopped. She listened. She walked back to the ruin without hurrying and without making additional noise, and she came in through the east gap in the wall and said, "Mira." Mira was already looking at her. "Northwest," Lena said. 2 of them at least. Maybe all 3. Mira moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had planned for this. Owen, Grace and Della, inside the walls. Barrow boys with Aldrich. She looked at Lena. "You, center position." "Mira, center. You're not a fighting position right now. You're what they're here for." Mira's eyes were steady. "The best thing you can do is be somewhere they can't easily reach." This was accurate, and Lena knew it. She went to the center position. Owen moved to the west wall gap. Colin took the north. Mira went to a position near the standing east corner that gave her the best angle of observation. The Barrow boys were inside, silent, understanding the gravity of the moment with the particular seriousness of children who have grown up in a camp and know what real danger sounds like. Grace sat against the inner wall with her knees pulled up and her face pale but controlled. Aldrich sat beside her. He had his documents inside his coat. Della sat on the opposite side with her mending. She had picked it up again. Lena stood in the center of the ruin and breathed and listened. The first hunter came through the northwest tree line at a pace that stopped abruptly when she saw Owen at the gap in the west wall. Owen was leaning against the stone with his arms crossed, and the specific quality of stillness that was not passive but was also not threatening. He simply existed in the gap in the manner of something that had always been there, and was not planning to stop. The first hunter was a tall woman. She had light coloring, and a way of moving that was economical and controlled. Bryn, Lena thought, the one who had carried out 2 previous orders without incident. Bryn looked at Owen. Owen looked at Bryn. The second hunter appeared from the east. Steele, the tracker. He stopped at a distance that was tactical rather than conversational. He was assessing the position. A long pause, no movement. Then Bryn said, in a voice that carried easily over the distance, "We're looking for Lena Calloway." "I know who you're looking for," Lena said from the center of the ruin. Everyone's attention shifted to her. She had not planned to be visible, but the alternative was being found hiding in a corner of her own situation, and she had not come this far to hide in corners. Bryn looked at her directly. Her expression was professional and without personal feeling, the expression of someone executing a task. "You're under an order of—" "I'm aware of the order," Lena said. "I'm also aware that it was issued based on information that was withheld from the king, and that this morning there's a recall rider moving from the palace." Bryn's expression did not change. "I have not received a recall. Not yet." A pause. The third hunter, Garrett the Younger, had appeared from the south. He held a position that closed the triangle, which was the appropriate tactical arrangement for this kind of situation. He was younger than the other 2, and his eyes moved between Bryn and Lena with something in them that was not quite certainty. "The order I'm carrying," Bryn said, "is a lawful execution of—" "The charge used to justify the exile decree was falsified," Lena said. "The decree carries a co-signature that was added without the king's knowledge. Both of these facts are now in the palace, in the king's hands, as of last night." Silence. Bryn was looking at her with the first trace of something other than professional neutrality. Not doubt, exactly, but the particular quality of attention that a person developed when information arrived that changed the shape of their situation. "I have no confirmation of any of that," she said. "I know. The confirmation is coming." Lena looked at her steadily. "You have 2 options. You wait for the recall, which is already moving, or you proceed with an order that was issued on falsified grounds and that has already been challenged at the palace level. In the second case, you will be carrying out an execution with documented justification removed from it." She paused. "You've done this work before. You know the difference between a lawful order and one that won't hold." Bryn was very still. Steele, the tracker, said from his position, "How long for the rider?" Lena looked at him. He was the one who had asked, which told her something about his internal assessment. "I don't know exactly. We're south of the main road. If the rider was dispatched before dawn, they could be—" "I know the distance," Steele said. He was looking at the ground, working through something in his mind. "Half a day, maybe less, if they came off the road and through the southern cut." A different silence than before. Garrett the Younger said, very quietly, "Bryn." Bryn looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Bryn looked at Lena. She looked at the ruin, at Owen in the gap, at Mira in the corner, at the Barrow boys visible through the east wall opening, sitting absolutely still. She looked at Lena's middle. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked back at Lena. "We'll hold position," she said, "until the rider comes through, one way or the other." Lena breathed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Bryn said. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I'm not going to carry out an order that 3 hours from now might turn out to be something I can't explain." She looked away. "Get inside your walls." Lena got inside her walls. She sat down on the earth floor next to Della, who had not stopped mending, and she picked up the corner of the blanket they were sitting on and folded it with unnecessary precision, because her hands needed something to do that was not related to the next several hours. Colin sat down on her other side. He didn't say anything. He handed her a piece of bread from the camp stores. She ate it. The waiting was long. Owen remained at the west gap. Mira moved quietly to a position where she could observe both the hunters' positions and the southern approach. The 3 hunters held their own positions with the professional stillness of people who knew how to wait and who had decided that waiting was the correct choice. Della mended. The Barrow boys, after 20 minutes, began to whisper to each other very quietly. Aldrich reviewed his documents one more time. Grace sat with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, and Lena thought she might be sleeping, which was either a sign of remarkable composure or of exhaustion that had simply overtaken everything else. The child moved. It was not a flutter this time. It was a genuine and unmistakable motion, the kind that Nessa had said would become increasingly obvious over the next month, the kind that could not be mistaken for anything else. Lena pressed her hand against her middle. She thought about the specific calculation that Bryn had made. She thought about a professional woman looking at a situation and deciding that waiting was worth the cost, because the alternative was carrying something she couldn't explain. She thought, people make better choices when they have accurate information. Her father had believed this, had built a network on this belief, had spent years moving information carefully to the people who needed it, so that they could make choices based on what was actually true, rather than what they had been told was true. He had not lived to see whether it worked. She was sitting in a ruin waiting for a recall rider, and she thought that the evidence suggested it worked. The rider arrived at 2 in the afternoon. They heard the horse before they saw it, coming through the southern cut at a pace that said the rider knew exactly where they were going. The sound broke through the tree line, and then the horse was there, a dark horse with a seal on its saddlecloth, and the rider was Peter, which was not what anyone expected. Peter slid off the horse before it had fully stopped. He was not dressed as a personal attendant. He was dressed practically, for travel, and he was carrying a sealed document in his right hand. He walked to the edge of the ruin and looked at Lena. "Recall order," he said. He held it out. She looked at it. She looked at Bryn. Bryn crossed the ground between them with 3 quick strides and took the document. She broke the seal with the practiced motion of someone who had opened official documents before and needed no ceremony for it. She read it. Her face did not change, but something in her shoulders shifted, a small release of a tension that had been held for 2 hours. "Recalled," she said. She looked at Steele, at Garrett the Younger. "We're done here." She looked at Lena one more time, something in her expression, very brief, that was not apology, and was not quite sympathy, but was somewhere in the same territory. Then she turned and walked back into the trees. Steele followed. Garrett the Younger looked at Lena for a moment longer. He said quietly, "I'm glad the rider was fast." Then he went. The forest was quiet. Peter was still standing at the edge of the ruin. He was looking at Lena with the expression of someone who has carried a specific instruction and is now deciding how to deliver it. "He sent me personally," Peter said, "because he wanted me to tell you directly that the order has been recalled, and that Vasek is under formal council review as of this morning." He paused, "and he wanted me to tell you one other thing." "What?" she said. Peter looked at a point slightly to the side of her head, the practiced attendant's angle of discretion. "He said he would like to come himself, that he understands if that is not welcome, that he would wait for your response before doing anything." The ruin was very quiet. Colin, to her left, did not move. Owen, still at the west gap, did not move. Mira, from her corner, watched. Lena looked at the recall document in Bryn's place, which was gone, which was what a revoked order looked like. She looked at Peter, who had ridden to the Southern Territory himself, outside his normal role, because someone had asked him to. She thought about the message she had sent, the message she had received, the sentence she had written about the child. She thought about the documents in Aldrich's coat, and the ones in Grace's hidden pocket, and the network her father had built over 8 years in unmarked crates and careful silences. She thought about what the next thing was. She said, "Tell him to come." Peter nodded once. He got back on his horse and rode north. After he was gone, the ruin was quiet for a long moment. Then the Barrow boys broke the silence by running out into the open and chasing each other in circles, the released energy of children who had been still for 2 hours and could not contain themselves a moment longer. Owen watched them with his large, calm face and said nothing. Mira put down her observation position and stretched her back with the sound of someone whose spine had opinions about standing against stone walls for extended periods. Grace opened her eyes from wherever she had been. "Is it done?" she said. "For today," Lena said. Grace closed her eyes again. "Wake me for dinner." Della put her mending away. Colin stood up and walked to the west gap where Owen had been standing, and looked out at the tree line that was now empty and unremarkable, and then he came back and sat down and said, "He's coming himself." "Yes. That's significant." "I know." Lena looked at the earth floor. "It doesn't resolve anything. It just means the conversation happens. What do you want from the conversation?" She thought about this properly. Not defensively, not with the kind of careful management she had been applying to everything for months, but actually, what she wanted. "I want the truth to be established," she said. "What Vasek did, what was withheld from the king, what happened to my father. I want those things named, formally, by someone with the authority to make the naming permanent. And after that?" She looked at the stone walls around her. "After that I'll see what's left." He nodded. He did not push further. He had a way of knowing when a question had received its complete answer, and the conversation was over, which was one of the most useful qualities she had ever encountered in a person. She looked at the Barrow boys, still running, and at Owen watching them, and at Della, who had somehow produced a cup of tea for Aldrich without anyone seeing her make it. She looked at this collection of people who had dismantled their home and carried it south, and stood inside stone walls and waited for a recall rider. For her. She thought about the pocket where she had been putting things she couldn't feel yet. She thought that it was becoming quite full. She sat with that. The afternoon light changed slowly on the stone, old light on old walls, patient and indifferent in the way of geological things. The Barrow boys slowed and stopped. Owen fed them something from the camp stores without being asked. Mira began assessing the ruin for where to put the tents, because whether Kalen Voss was coming or not, this was where they were sleeping tonight. Lena watched the light on the stone and thought about what she was going to say to him. She thought about it for a long time. She did not arrive at anything that felt complete, but she arrived at something that felt honest, and honest was the only foundation she was willing to build anything else on. The tents went up, the fire went down, low and efficient. Dinner was made and eaten and the camp settled into its evening rhythms, and Lena sat outside the tent she had been sleeping in for 2 days, and looked at the southern sky, and thought that she had been surviving for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be deciding. This, whatever came next, was a decision. She did not know the outcome. She thought that not knowing the outcome and making the decision anyway was the thing her father had done over and over again, all those years, with his careful hands and his unmarked crates. She thought she could do it too. She went inside and lay down and put her hand on her middle. "We're going to be all right," she said to the dark. The child moved. She took that as agreement. He arrived the following morning. She had not expected him until midday at the earliest, which meant he had left the palace in the night, which meant that when Peter delivered her answer, the answer had been, immediately. She heard the horse before she saw it. Then she saw it. A single rider, no guard, no attendant. He had come alone, which was either a very clear statement of intent or a very significant risk, and she suspected he understood it as both. He stopped at the edge of the ruin. He dismounted. He looked different from the last time she had seen him. Not smaller, but less constructed. He was not in ceremonial clothing. He was in riding clothes, dusty from the road, and his face was not the closed face from the courtyard. He looked like someone who had made a very long night ride while turning over a very heavy load of thought. She stood in the center of the ruin, which was where she had stood the day before when the hunters came, and she thought that she kept ending up in this position, central and accountable, and refusing to be anything other than what she was. He walked forward. He stopped at a distance that was not close, and not far, but was definitely not designed to give him any particular advantage. Around them, the camp had gone very quiet in the way camps did when the people in them understood that something important was happening, and had the respect not to insert themselves into it. "You came," she said. "You said I could," he said. A pause. She looked at him. She thought that she had spent months holding him at the careful distance of a man who had done specific things, and that the distance had been useful and correct, and that it was now in the process of becoming something slightly different because he was standing in front of her in riding clothes covered in road dust, having ridden through the night alone. She did not let the distance collapse, but she let it become more specific. "There are people here who need formal protection," she said. "Aldrich Fenmore, who was forced out of his council position. Grace, from your supply staff, who has been operating an information network for 8 years and who is now outside the palace and exposed." She paused. "And Mira, who runs this camp, and everyone in it. They helped me. That needs to be acknowledged formally." "It will be," he said. "In writing. Witnessed." "In writing, witnessed," he agreed. "Today, if you want." She held his eyes. "And the investigation into Vasik's conduct is proceeding through proper channels, not through a process he can influence. He is no longer on the council as of this morning. The formal review is being conducted by Petra and Weld, who have no history of alignment with him." He paused. "I am recusing myself from the formal review, to avoid the appearance of personal motivation influencing the outcome." She blinked once. "That is not the obvious choice." "It's the correct one." He looked at her steadily. "The investigation needs to be credible. It can only be credible if I'm not running it." She thought. He has been thinking about this carefully. She thought. That is not nothing. "My father," she said. "The investigation needs to include a full examination of the circumstances of his illness and the medical records from that period." Something moved in his face, not the closed expression, something with more weather in it. "It will," he said. I promise you it will. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what to say next. She thought about the months of surviving and the people around her who had helped her survive, and the child who had been present for all of it, and the sentence she had written about not being used as a weapon by anyone on either side. She said, I need you to understand something before we go any further. All right? I am not coming back to the palace because you need an heir. I am not making any arrangement because of the child. The child is a person, not a card. I will not allow the child to be used as a card by me, by you, by Vasek, by anyone. She held his eyes. If whatever comes next is built on the child's existence as justification, it will not hold. He was quiet. I understand, he said. Say it with more precision than that. He looked at her. For a moment she saw the person from the library, the one who had been surprised into laughing, and then he said, You are not coming back because I need an heir. You are coming back if you come back on whatever terms you set. The child is your child, and whatever relationship the child has with me is on a separate track from whatever relationship you and I have, and both of those things are yours to determine. She breathed in. That is more precise, she said. He almost smiled. It was very small, and it was real. She thought about the East Wing library, and the conversation that had started about records and become something else. She thought about the closed face in the courtyard and the Exiled decree and the decision he had made too fast with too little information. She thought about the night ride and the dust on his riding clothes and the choice to come alone. She was not ready to forgive him. She was not sure forgiveness was the applicable concept yet, but she was standing in a stone ruin in the southern forest talking to a man who had ridden through the night to show up alone, and that was a set of facts she was going to keep accurate in her mind. I'm going to set conditions, she said. I expected that. In writing. I know. And you're going to sign them before I come back inside those walls. A pause. All of them? All of them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Then you should know that I intend to try to meet whatever conditions you set, not as a transaction, because they will be fair and I will owe them. She looked at him. She thought, We are going to have to figure out what we are. That is not today's task. Today's task is getting the conditions right. Aldrich has paper, she said, and a very good memory for what matters. She walked toward the ruin. He followed. The conditions took 3 hours to write. Aldrich was the scribe. Lena dictated. Kaelin sat on the other side of the fire and listened and occasionally said, Agreed, or, Add this clause, and once said, I need to revise that slightly to make it legally operable within pack law, and then proposed a revision that was actually better than what she had dictated, which she acknowledged without pleasure, and accepted without hesitation. Colin sat behind Lena and said nothing. His presence was, she had begun to understand, the kind that was steady and present, and specifically not imposing itself, which was its own kind of support. Mira sat at the perimeter and watched the tree line, because Mira's understanding of any situation was that it was not fully resolved until it was fully resolved, and that until that point, keeping one eye on the exit remained appropriate. The conditions were comprehensive: formal written protection for every member of the camp, extending full pack standing to any who wished it, and safe passage to any who did not. Full acknowledgement of Aldrich Fenmore's witness account as a legal document in the investigation of Elder Vasek's conduct. Grace's position on the supply staff restored, and her 8 years of network work formally recognized as loyal service rather than treasonable activity. An independent medical review of Garrett Calloway's illness and care records, to be conducted by healers who had no connection to anyone currently or previously on the Iron Veil Council. A formal review of the Exiled decree, including the identification and investigation of the second signature. An explicit statement that the child, when born, would be recognized in whatever capacity was appropriate under pack law, and that this recognition would be determined through a process that included Lena's documented agreement at each stage, and one clause that she wrote herself, in her own handwriting, and inserted at the end. The clause said, The Alpha King acknowledges that decisions made during the period under Elder Vasek's primary influence may have been made with incomplete or false information, and that acknowledgement of this does not constitute a full accounting for the harm caused. A full accounting will occur through a separate process, to be defined by Lena Calloway, at a time of her choosing. She looked at this clause for a long time. Then she handed it to Aldrich to incorporate. Kaelin read it when it was incorporated into the full document. He read it twice. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Yes. Aldrich read the final document aloud, all of it, which took 12 minutes. No one interrupted. Owen had come in from the perimeter and was standing at the edge of the group, his arms crossed, listening with the particular attention of someone who was not going to miss a word. When Aldrich finished, Kaelin signed it. Then Lena signed it. Then Aldrich signed as witness. Then Mira, called from the perimeter, signed as witness, looking at Lena across the paper with an expression that said very clearly, "This is the beginning, not the end." Lena looked back with an expression that said, "I know." There were multiple copies. Aldrich copied the document twice more with his meticulous hand. One copy stayed with Lena. One went with Kaelin. One was sealed and handed to Grace, who put it in her interior pocket beside the other documents she had been carrying. The Barrow boys watched all of this with the serious attention of children who understood they were witnessing something significant, even if they could not name all its elements. Then Della said, in the tone of someone who had determined that the meeting had concluded, "Lunch." And somehow that was the end of the formal portion. The camp ate. It was a strange meal. Not quite comfortable, and not quite uncomfortable. The strangest part was that Kaelin Voss ate the same food as everyone else, sitting on the same camp log, and said thank you when Della handed him a bowl, and Della looked at him with the particular assessment of an old woman who has seen many things, and then handed him an extra piece of bread, which Lena chose to interpret as provisional approval. Aldrich sat beside Kaelin, which surprised her. But Aldrich had once been a council clerk and apparently, in the light of a signed agreement, was prepared to treat the person he had spent months circumventing as an actual person. They were talking about the council investigation, specific and practical, when she turned her attention there. Aldrich was describing the timeline of document forgery he had pieced together. Kaelin was listening with the focused attention she recognized from the library, the kind of listening that was not waiting for its turn to speak but was actually processing. She looked away. Colin appeared beside her. He was eating his own food and looking at the middle distance. After a moment he said, "How are you?" "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the fire. "About whether today means what it feels like it means, or whether I'm giving it too much weight." "So," Colin ate for a moment in silence. "What does it feel like it means?" "Like something has shifted." She held her bowl. "I've been surviving for 5 months. Surviving requires a specific kind of thinking, very forward, very immediate, no room for anything that isn't necessary. Today feels like the first day where the shape of things ahead is not just immediate necessity." He looked at his food. "That sounds like it could be frightening." "It is." She looked at him. "I'm not used to space. I've been filling every inch of time with what had to be done. Maybe you should try filling an inch with something that doesn't have to be done." She thought about this. "Such as?" He looked at the trees. "I have no idea. I'm working on the same problem from a different direction." He paused. "I might go back to a pack, a real one. Now that there's possibly safe passage, Mira mentioned it. It might be." He stopped. She looked at him. "Right," she said. "It might be right for you." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she recognized and that she also set aside carefully, because she was 5 months along and in the middle of an agreement with a man who had created the situation she was in. And the timing was what it was. "Yes," he said. "It probably is." They sat for a moment in the specific silence of two people who have acknowledged something without resolving it. "You were a good person to be stuck in a forest with," she said. He almost smiled. "Likewise." She thought. "I will tell him, properly, what he meant in the months that needed him. Not now, but when there is space for it, she would do that." She looked across the fire at Kaelin, who was still talking with Aldrich. He looked up at that moment and met her eyes, and the specific quality of the look was not the closed face from the courtyard, and was not the private face from the library, but was something in between, something that was still being formed, which she thought was probably accurate to where things were. She looked away first. In the afternoon, Kaelin came to where she was sitting alone outside the camp for the first time since the document was signed. He did not sit down without being invited. He stood at a respectful distance and waited. She looked at him for a moment, then she indicated the space beside her. He sat. They were quiet for a moment, looking at the southern forest, the trees and the afternoon light coming through them, in the specific way of the season. "The investigation is going to find things that are difficult," he said. "About Vasek's conduct, about how decisions were made, about your father." He paused. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the full truth is more than either of us has yet." "I know," she said. "And I want to say, clearly, outside of any document, I am sorry for what was done in my name without my knowledge, and I am sorry for what was done in my name with my knowledge, but without adequate thought." He paused. "Those are different things, and I understand they require different kinds of accounting." She looked at the trees. "My father used to say that the most important thing a person in power could do was understand the difference between what they decided and what they allowed. That's more precise than most things I've heard about governance. He was precise, she breathed in. He was also right that the difference matters. A quiet moment. I allowed a great deal, Kalen said. Yes. I'm not going to excuse it with the information I didn't have. The information I did have should have been enough to ask more questions. He looked at the ground. I didn't ask them because asking them was complicated, and the alternative was available. I know. She looked at him. That's the part that will take longer to account for. I know. Another quiet. Your father's network, he said. Vasek didn't know about it. No. How did he not know? Because my father understood that the most important things can be built quietly and completely, while no one is looking, if you're patient enough, and you trust the right people. She paused. Vasek was looking for large movements, visible opposition. My father made himself invisible. He was protecting you. He was doing that too, she breathed out. He was also building something for after him. He just didn't know after him would come so soon. She was quiet. I'm going to name the network, she said, formally. Whatever it becomes going forward. He never named it. What will you call it? She thought. She thought about unmarked crates and careful hands and a conversation at a graveside. She thought about 8 years of information moving through a market in pieces small enough to miss. I'll tell you when I know, she said. He nodded. They sat in the afternoon light for a while longer, not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, which she thought was probably the correct state for where they were. When the light started to change toward evening, she stood up. I need to talk to my people, she said. Of course, he stood too. She looked at him. Tomorrow we'll talk about logistics. What happens next? What happens practically? Who goes where? Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow. She walked back toward the camp. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard him stay where he was for a moment. Then his footsteps, moving in a different direction, giving her the space she had not needed to ask for. She thought, he is trying. She thought, I will see whether trying is enough. She walked into the camp where her people were, and the fire was going, and Della was doing something useful with the evening meal, and the Barrow boys were explaining something complicated to Owen, who was listening with more patience than the complexity of the explanation probably required, and Mira was sitting with her cup and watching everything. Mira looked at her. She sat down beside Mira. Well? Mira said. We go back tomorrow, Lena said. Everyone who wants to. On our own terms. Mira looked at the fire. My people have been wandering for years. Having a home isn't something I'm opposed to. It won't be simple. Nothing good is. Lena looked at the camp, at the tents and the fire and the people who had moved all of this for her, carried it south, stood inside stone walls because she needed them there. She thought about the pocket full of things she had been refusing to feel. She thought, tomorrow. She thought, tonight, just this. She looked at the fire. She let herself feel it. That night, around the fire, everyone was there. Owen, Della, Aldrich, Grace, Colin, Mira, the Barrow boys, who should have been asleep and were not, and no one was insisting on it tonight, and Kalen, who sat at the edge of the fire's light in a position that was present without being central. Someone started talking, then someone else. Not about the day, not about the documents or the hunters or the recall order. About other things. Owen's story about the pack he had left, told with the dry humor of someone who had found the distance to find it funny. Della's account of her first year in the Outer Lands, which was more difficult and more interesting than anything Lena had expected. The younger Barrow boy's careful explanation of his personal theory about the stars, which was elaborate and sincere, and partly correct in ways he couldn't have known. Lena sat and listened. At some point Colin said something that made Aldrich laugh, which was a sound she had not heard before, lower and more genuine than she would have expected. The Barrow boys looked at each other with the delight of children who have observed something surprising in adults. Grace said to Mira, quietly, How long have you been running camps? 7 years, Mira said. Do you have family and a pack somewhere? A pause. I had. Mira looked at the fire. I made different choices than my family wanted. That was fine. I made them anyway. She paused. I have this. She gestured, not broadly, not dramatically, just the small, specific gesture of indicating what was in front of her. That seems like enough, Grace said. Most days, Mira agreed. Lena looked across the fire. Kalen was watching the older Barrow boy explain a second star theory, which was even more elaborate than the first, and his expression was the one she had seen in the library, genuinely interested, present, not performing attention but actually providing it. She looked away before he looked back. Later, when the fire was low and the camp was moving toward sleep, Mira stopped beside her on the way to the tent. He carried no guard, Mira said. I noticed. That's not something men like him do without intention. I know. Mira looked at the dying fire. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just noting what I observed. You're someone who notes things precisely, Lena said. Mira almost smiled. It's a useful habit. She paused. Sleep well. She went to the tent. Lena stood by the fire until it was coals, and she thought about intention and about what it meant that a person showed up a certain way, and she thought about conditions in writing and accounting that would take time, and everything that was not resolved. She thought, this is real. She thought, real things are complicated, and complicated things can be built on, if the foundation is honest. She put her hand on her middle. Tomorrow, she said to the child, tomorrow we go. The coals settled. She went to the tent. She slept without difficulty for the first time in 5 months. The formal investigation into Elder Vasik's conduct began 8 days after they returned to the palace. Lena was not in the palace. She was in the village at the foot of the hill, in a house that belonged to an older woman named Ruth who had been one of her father's acquaintances, and who had offered the house without being asked when she heard Lena was looking for a place to stay outside the palace walls during the transition. Ruth was practical and unobtrusive, and made excellent soup, and asked no questions beyond the practical ones, which made her the ideal landlady for the particular period Lena was navigating. She went up to the palace when required. She went for the investigation proceedings that needed her presence. She went for the meeting with council member Petra, who was conducting the review with the composed efficiency of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to run things properly, and intended to use it well. She went for a meeting with council member Dre, the physician-adjacent one, to discuss the medical review of her father's records. She did not go for unnecessary reasons. She was invited to dinner 3 times. She declined the first 2, and accepted the third because Aldrich would be there, and she wanted to see how he was managing the transition back to an official role, which he was navigating with the particular intensity of a man who had spent 2 years in the outer lands and was now trying to remember how to exist inside walls. The dinner was in the smaller of the formal rooms, not ceremonial, practical. 6 people at a table. Aldrich, who was managing. Grace, who had been formally reinstated and was already, according to the supply staff she had heard from, reorganizing the record-keeping with a thoroughness that was causing varying degrees of appreciation and consternation. Petra, who was exactly as organized at a dinner table as she was in a council chamber. Peter, who was clearly more comfortable now that everything was moving in a direction that did not require him to keep track of 17 competing silences. And Kaylin. The dinner was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she noticed first. It was specific and purposeful rather than ceremonial. And Petra was running it efficiently, and the food was good. And Aldrich said something at one point that made Peter laugh so genuinely that it startled everyone, including Peter. Kaylin watched her more than he spoke to her, not obtrusively, but she was aware of it, the particular quality of attention of someone who was being careful. She thought, careful. She thought, that's something. After dinner, in the corridor on the way out, he fell into step beside her. They walked a few paces in silence. You're comfortable in the village? He said. Ruth makes good soup. I know Ruth. She made soup for my father. A pause. What was he like? She said. Your father. He was quiet for a moment.
Decisive,
he said.
Effective. Not particularly warm, but fair.
He paused.
I think he was better at governance than at people.
And you? He thought about this honestly, which she appreciated.
I think I have the opposite problem.
I understand people more than I have always acted like I do, and governance is something I do well when I'm not letting someone else construct the information I'm making decisions from. She looked at the corridor they were walking. It was not the East Wing corridor. She had not been back to the East Wing yet. That was on a different timeline. The investigation is going well, she said. Petra is formidable. She is. Lena paused. She was on the council while Vasek was. She missed things. She acknowledged that. In writing, on her own initiative. He paused. That's worth something. It is. She looked at the corridor. Everyone in that council room missed things. Some of them because they were being managed and some of them because looking away was easier. He was quiet. I'm not saying that to assign blame, she said. I'm saying it because the investigation needs to determine which is which. I know. They reached the place where the corridor branched, one direction toward the exit and Ruth's soup and the village, one direction deeper into the palace. She stopped. He stopped. I'm going to name the network, she said. I told you I would tell you when I knew. What will you call it? The Callaway correspondence, she said, after my father. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression that was not the closed face, and was not the careful face, and was not yet anything she had a name for. That's a good name, he said. I know. She looked at the corridor that led out. Good night. Good night, he said. She walked out. She went down the hill to the village and Ruth's house, and Ruth's uncomplicated hospitality, and she lay on the bed in the room Ruth had given her, and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the investigation, and the network, and what she was going to do with the space that was opening up, now that survival was no longer the only available mode. She thought about the East Wing library and when she would go back to it. She thought she might go on a morning when the light was good. She thought she was not in a hurry. She breathed in. She breathed out. She put her hand on her middle. The child was active in the evenings now, had opinions about things, communicated them in the particular emphatic way of someone who could not yet speak. I know, she said. A lot is happening. The child had a response to this. Yes, she said. You've been very patient. She smiled at the ceiling. The boy was born on the first clear day after a week of rain. He arrived with the particular emphatic quality of someone who had been ready for quite some time and simply needed the circumstances to cooperate, which they finally did at 4 a.m. while Nessa and a palace healer named Dr. Callum worked together with the focused efficiency of two people who respected each other's competence without requiring ceremony. Lena had moved into the palace the month before, not into the Alpha's wing, into a set of rooms on the second floor that had a view of the south garden and windows that let in the morning light and a door that locked from the inside, which she had checked before she agreed to the arrangement. The rooms were adjacent to the healer's hall, which had been Nessa's practical recommendation and which Lena had agreed to with the same practicality. Ruth had packed her bags and kissed her on the cheek and said, "Come back for soup whenever you need it," and Lena had said she would. The last 3 months had been full in the way of things that were being properly handled. The investigation into Vasek's conduct had concluded with findings that were comprehensive and damning and specific. He had been formally removed from the council and exiled under the same provision he had used to exile Lena, which was technically appropriate and also something that Petra had arranged with a particular expression of quiet satisfaction. The second signature on the exile decree had been formally identified and documented. The falsified medical records had been reviewed by 3 independent healers, all 3 of whom had produced consistent assessments. The investigation into Garrett Calloway's death had not arrived at a legal conclusion. The evidence was circumstantial. Vasek had been careful, as always. But the medical assessment was clear enough that the formal record had been amended to reflect what the 3 healers had actually found, and Lena had stood in the records room and watched Aldrich incorporate the amendment and thought that her father would have found the document trail satisfying. She had cried after that. In private, in Ruth's kitchen, with Ruth's unobjectionable silence and one of her soup cups for something to hold, she had cried for a long time, and then she had gone back up the hill, and she had told herself that the crying had been for her father, and that it was right and appropriate, and that she was allowed to keep moving forward, and that moving forward did not mean leaving him behind. She had taken the 7-word note and the second 7-word note and the message about the hunters and put them in a box that Aldrich had given her, a small cedar box with a good lock, the Callaway correspondence, archived. She had started writing the actual correspondence into a formal document structure with Grace's help. The 8 years of network, carefully reconstructed, noting what had moved through what channel and who had been involved, not as accusation, as history, as a record of what her father had built and how it had worked and what it had accomplished. She was not finished with it yet. She thought she might not be finished with it for a long time, but the beginning was written. In the weeks before the birth, Kaylin had come to the South Garden most mornings. Sometimes she was there, sometimes she was not. When she was there, they talked. When she was not, he came and sat alone for a while and then left, which she knew because Patrick the groundskeeper mentioned it once in passing, and then clearly regretted mentioning it, and she had said nothing about it. The talks in the garden had covered a lot of ground, the council's structure and how it needed to change, the question of what to do with the alliances Vasek had influenced during his tenure, the Whitfield engagement, which had been dissolved with the cooperation of the Whitfield pack, who had their own misgivings about the alliance, and had accepted the dissolution with what appeared to be genuine relief on both sides. They had talked about her father. She had told him things and he had listened without trying to turn listening into anything else, which was the correct response. They had not talked about what they were to each other. She had decided that this conversation required the completion of certain other things first, and she had held to this, and he had understood and held to it alongside her without making it a source of pressure, which was the best possible way he could have handled it. She thought about this during the long hours of labor, not obsessively, but the mind went where it went. The boy arrived at 4 in the morning. He was not a large infant. He was precisely the right size, Nessa said, and everything about him was in order. And when Lena held him for the first time, and looked at the particular quality of his focus, the way he looked at her with the serious attention of a person taking in important information, she thought that she recognized something in it that she had seen in a library late at night. She did not say this aloud. She said hello, the way she had said it in a tent in the forest 5 months ago, a greeting to someone she was only beginning to know. He looked at her. She thought, "You have been very patient." Dr. Callum came and went. Nessa stayed. The Palace Healer's Hall was quiet at this hour, all its usual business suspended by the particular suspension that surrounded birth, the way the world paused briefly in recognition. She did not send word immediately. She wanted an hour, just this first hour, with no one else in it. She sat with the boy and looked at him, and thought about the road that had ended here, from the blood moon ceremony to a library to a courtyard to 11 minutes of corridors to 3 months of forest and camps and stone walls and 7-word notes. And she thought that the road was long and complicated and contained things she was still working through, and that all of it had brought her to this specific moment with this specific person looking at her, with this specific quality of new and serious attention. The hour passed. She sent Nessa to tell Kaelin. He came. He knocked, which was correct. She said come in, which was her choice. He came in and stood just inside the door and looked at the boy in her arms with the expression she had decided she was not going to name for him, because naming it was his job. He stood there for a while. Then he said, "May I come closer?" She indicated the chair beside the bed. He sat in it. The three of them were in the same space for the first time. This was a fact. She held it alongside all the other facts. He looked at the boy with the focused attention she had come to recognize, the actual attention rather than the performed kind. The boy looked back with his particular seriousness. "He looks at things," Kaelin said. "He does." "What's his name?" She had thought about this for 2 months. She had not discussed it with him, because the name was hers to give first. That was a thing she had understood about herself very clearly. "Garrett," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good name," he said. His voice had a quality in it that was not quite unsteady, but was not quite the controlled voice from the council chamber either. "I know." She looked at the boy. "He's going to know who his grandfather was, all of it. The real version." "Yes," Kaelin said. "He should." She looked at Kaelin. He looked at her. The boy between them looked at the ceiling with the concentrated interest of someone encountering ceiling for the first time and finding it worth examining. She thought about conditions in writing. She thought about the investigation, and the naming of the network and Ruth's soup and the mornings in the South Garden, and everything that was still open, and being worked on, and would be for a long time. She thought about a conversation she was not yet ready to have, about who they were to each other, but that she was beginning to understand, was not as far away as it had been. She thought about what Mira had said at the start of all of this. Mourning is better for figuring. She thought that was still true. "I'm going to need to rest," she said. He stood immediately. "Of course." He started toward the door. "Kaelin." He stopped. She looked at him. "You can come back tomorrow," she said, "if you want to meet him properly." Something in his face that was not the closed expression, and was not the careful expression, and was not yet something she had named, but was moving toward being something she could work with. "Yes," he said. "I would like that." "Tomorrow, then." He nodded. He left. Nessa came back in and did the things that healers did after births, checking and measuring and making notes, and Lena sat with the boy and looked out the window at the South Garden, which was dark, and thought that in a few hours it would be light, and Patrick would come out with his tools and his careful eyes, and the garden would be what it was, and tomorrow Kaelin would come and meet his son, and the day after that there would be other things, and the day after that other things again. One thing at a time. Mornings were better for figuring. But this morning, at 4:15, she already knew the most important thing. She held her son and listened to the palace breathe around her in its solid and permanent way, and she thought that permanence was not always indifference. Sometimes it was something you could put your weight against. She thought about the East Wing Library. She thought she would go on a morning when the light was good. She thought she might go soon. "We're all right," she told Garrett. He did not look up from the ceiling, which had maintained his interest throughout. She smiled. She held him. The night finished. The morning came. She was still there. 2 weeks after Garrett was born, the council chamber held its first formal session under the revised council structure. Vasik's chair had been removed, not symbolically, practically. The table had been rearranged, and there were 2 new council members who had been appointed through a process that was documented and open, and that Petra had designed with the specific intention of making it impossible to run the way the old appointment process had been run. Aldrich was one of the new members. He sat at the table with the expression of someone who was not entirely certain this was where he belonged, and who had decided to belong there anyway. Lena thought her father would have found this development exactly right. She attended the session as an observer. She sat at the side of the room, not at the table. She had been offered a place at the table and had declined, not permanently but for now, because she was still learning the full shape of what had happened during the Vasik years, and she needed to understand it completely before she could contribute usefully to what came after. The session covered 7 items of governance. It was efficient and specific. Petra ran it with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything. 2 of the 7 items were directly related to reversing decisions that the investigation had flagged as Vasek influenced. One was the formal reinstatement of 3 individuals, including Aldrich, who had been moved out of their positions in the years before Lena's exile. 1 item concerned the Callaway correspondence. Lena had submitted a formal proposal for the network's continuation, not as a secret operation but as an acknowledged part of the PAC's information and welfare structure. The proposal outlined how it would work going forward, a formal system for gathering information from outside official channels, staffed by people who chose the role, operating under documented protocols, with oversight from the council. Her father's invisible structure, brought into the light. The council reviewed it. Aldrich abstained from the vote because of personal connection to the matter. The remaining 5 council members voted. 5 in favor, none opposed. Grace, sitting in the observer area on the other side of the room, caught her eye. Lena gave her the small, slow nod, the one she had received months ago at the blood moon ceremony, from a woman she had barely known. Grace gave it back. After the session, Kaylin walked with her through the corridor toward the south wing. It was, she thought, the first time they had walked together in the palace without a specific agenda, without documents or formal agreements, or things that needed to be arranged, just walking. The proposal passed, he said. I know, I was there. Are you satisfied with the structure? She thought about it honestly. I think it's the right structure. I think it will take time to establish in the way it needs to be. She paused. Most things do. They walked past the East Wing corridor. She slowed. He slowed with her. She looked at the East Wing corridor. The doors were open now. The structural assessment had been completed 2 weeks before, which had coincided so closely with Garrett's birth that the timing had felt slightly intentional, though Patrick, when asked, had simply said the assessment had concluded when it concluded, and looked at the ground. The library was at the end of that corridor. She had not been back. She stood at the entrance to the corridor for a moment. I'll come with you or I won't, Kaylin said, whichever is correct. She looked at the corridor. She looked at him. Come, she said. They walked to the library. It was exactly as it had been. Books, tables, the lamps that needed someone to light them and had waited unlit for 5 months. The smell of paper and old wood, and the particular quietness of a room that held a great deal of knowledge and was patient about it. She walked in. She walked to the table where she had been working on records the night of the conversation that had become something else. She stood there. He stood at the door, not entering further. She looked at the table. She thought about that night. She held it properly, without managing it, just let it be what it was, a real thing that had happened between 2 people who were both more and less themselves than they knew, in a room that had no opinion about any of it. She breathed in. She breathed out. She looked at the lamp on the table and thought about lighting it. Do you remember, she said, what you said to me that night, the specific thing that made me stop working and actually talk to you? He was quiet for a moment. I said that the record system was organized around what the council wanted to find rather than what was actually there. Yes. She looked at him across the room. You were right. And it made me want to talk to you, because I had been thinking the same thing for 2 years and had not said it aloud because I didn't know who was safe to say it to. And I said it because I'd been thinking it for longer, and I was in a room with someone who looked like they'd know what I meant. She looked at him. He looked at her. She thought about the months between that night and this one, about everything that had happened and everything that had been lost and everything that had, against considerable odds, been held together. She thought, I am not ready to be finished being careful. She also thought, I am done with caution that prevents me from building anything. She looked at the lamp. Light it, she said. He came into the library. He found the matches on the shelf where they had always been, because the library had its own logic that did not change with time, and he lit the lamp, and the room filled with the particular warm light of oil lamps that was different from any other kind of light, older and less demanding. She sat down at the table. He sat across from her, where he had not sat that night, because that night he had stood, and she had sat, and the arrangement had been accidental in the way that only mattered in retrospect. Now they were both sitting, which was different. "I am going to have conditions for this too," she said. "What we are. I expected that. They're going to be extensive. I understand. And some of them are going to take time to arrive at, because I don't know all of them yet. I know." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going anywhere." She thought about this. She thought about the night ride, and the dust, and the choice to come alone, and the month of mornings in the South Garden, and a man who had sat in a chair beside a hospital bed, and held absolutely still, so as not to crowd the space she needed. She thought about her father's network and a cedar box with a lock, and Garrett looking at the ceiling with the same quality of attention. She thought, this is real. She thought, real things are hard. She thought, I've been doing hard things for a long time and I am still here. She looked at him. The first condition, she said, is that we're honest. About everything. Even when it's inconvenient. Yes, he said. The second is that Garrett always comes first, in every decision where his welfare is relevant. Yes. The third. She paused. She had not known there would be a third one yet, and then there it was. The third is that you tell me when you're managing a situation instead of being in it. I can tell the difference, and I'd rather you just say so. He was quiet for a moment. That's a fair condition, he said. All of my conditions are fair. I know. She breathed in, she breathed out. She looked at the lamp, burning steadily on the table between them. Start talking, she said. We have a lot of ground to cover. He started talking. She listened. Outside, the day was doing what days did, cycling through its ordinary hours, and Patrick was in the gardens doing what he always did, and in the healer's hall, a floor above the library, Garrett was sleeping with the concentrated fullness of someone who had no concerns about the day, because the day was being handled. And the library was lit, for the first time in 5 months, and 2 people were talking in it, with the particular kind of honesty that came from having survived the alternative. The morning came and went. They were still there.